Hello, and welcome back. Whether you're here for the first time tonight or you've been with us before, I'm really glad you're here. I'm Mr. Dantello, and this is where we gather when the world gets quiet, when you're ready to settle in and explore the darker corners of the ordinary. Tonight, we're venturing into abandoned places and lost locations. Those spaces that still hold something of what they were, even after everyone's gone. There's a particular weight to these stories, a kind of haunting that comes not from anything supernatural necessarily, but from the simple fact of absence. We have 4 stories for you tonight. First, we'll explore the factory floor still smells like yesterday's shift. A story about what lingers when a place empties out. Then we'll move to I Found My Name Carved into the Abandoned Well, where discovery leads somewhere unexpected. After that, we're visiting the subdivision where all the houses face inward, a place where something about the design feels deliberately wrong. And finally, we'll descend into the utility tunnels beneath the town I grew up in, where the familiar becomes strange when you see it from below. If you're new here and you're enjoying this, please do consider subscribing. And if you've already done so, thank you. It means the world. Now, get yourself comfortable. Find a position where you can really settle in. Dim the lights if you haven't already. And let yourself just be here with these stories. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Now, let's begin with our first story. Story 1. The factory floor still smells like yesterday's shift. The loading dock door was heavier than it looked. The rust had calcified around the frame over decades, and when I shouldered it open, the screech it made seemed to echo backward through time, a sound that hadn't been heard in this corridor in years. Dust fell from the lintel like disturbed snow. I waited for the sound to settle before stepping through. The smell hit me first, not the chemical sweetness of industrial decay I'd grown accustomed to in other abandoned facilities, detergent, solvents, the ghost scent of machinery oil. No, this was something else, something almost domestic. Stale coffee. Fibers, human warmth, somehow preserved in the dead air. The smell of a shift change that never happened. I was inside the Hartley Textile Mill now. 3 stories of red brick and broken skylights, built in 1923 according to the faded paint on the east wall. The loading dock opened directly onto the factory floor, and even in the muted afternoon light filtering through gaps in the boarded windows, I could make out the machinery. The great looms and spinners standing like statues at the moment of their abandonment, as if they'd simply stopped mid-breath and waited for someone to tell them to start again. My name is Morgan. I document places like this. Not professionally, not officially, just me, a camera, and the compulsion to record what's being forgotten. I started 3 years ago after finding a photograph of my grandmother in her graduation dress, standing in front of a factory I didn't know existed. The photo was dated 1967. I looked up the location. The building had been closed since 1979, and I became obsessed with the gap between those dates. What happened in those 12 years? Who worked there after my grandmother's generation moved on? The building stood for another 42 years completely empty, and no one asked. No one documented it. It was just abandoned, and then they tore it down. After that, I couldn't leave them alone. The factory floor stretched farther than the exterior suggested. The space opened up in stages. First, the loading area with its metal bins and hand trucks tipped over like defeated animals. Then the actual production floor where the light changed. Here the skylights created long rectangles of pale illumination that fell across the machinery like a grid, and in those strips of light I could see everything more clearly. Everything was exactly where it had been left. There were workstations, stations with small tables and folding chairs, spools of thread in cardboard boxes, a pegboard with tools, wire cutters, scissors, measuring tapes, still organized as if someone had arranged them that morning. On one of the small tables near the window, I saw what made me stop walking: a coffee mug. It was a ceramic mug, yellowed and stained brown at the bottom. The liquid inside had long since evaporated, leaving only a ring and dust. But beside it lay a time card still in its punch slot, and I could see the date printed on it, March 14th, 1979. The punch marks on the back recorded the arrival time, 7:47 a.m. There was no departure mark, no clocking out, no end to the day. I moved closer, deliberately slow. The floor was a landscape of dust, and my footsteps created small clouds that hung briefly in the air before settling again. I was careful not to disturb anything. This was sacred in its way. This was the moment right before something changed forever. I found more coffee mugs as I moved deeper into the production floor. There was a break area, a few tables clustered together, a refrigerator the color of old cream, its door hanging open to reveal nothing but darkness inside. 3 more mugs, all with the same rings of evaporated coffee. A lunch pail, still closed, its metal lid slightly warped. A paperback book face down on a table, its spine so damaged it had split completely. I couldn't make out the title. The pages had yellowed to the color of old teeth. The looms themselves were monuments to industry. Iron frames 10 feet high, pulleys and wheels and intricate systems of tension and release, spools of finished fabric still loaded on their racks, some wrapped in brown paper with labels too faded to read, others exposed to air and dust, their colors muted by decades, blues that had been vibrant, reds that had faded to rust, creams and off-whites that had taken on the monochromatic patina of everything else in the building. I took photographs with deliberate attention to detail, close-ups of the time cards, wide shots of the production line in the honeyed light from the skylights, a portrait of that open refrigerator door, yawning at nothing. The machinery always photographs best in this kind of light. It becomes abstract, almost sculptural. The abandonment reads like intention when you frame it correctly through a lens. It was while I was photographing the lunch pail that I noticed something wrong with the dust. The dust on the factory floor wasn't uniform. That's what made it visible. There were patterns, scuffs, marks that looked like footprints, though they were faint enough that I only caught them in certain angles of light. I turned slowly, trying to map them out. They seemed to radiate from the deeper part of the facility, from the direction I hadn't explored yet. They weren't my footprints. I hadn't walked that far. I straightened, and the feeling arrived then, not fear exactly, but that particular alertness that comes with being somewhere you shouldn't be. The awareness that you are looking at the layout of a space in a different way. Not as a place to explore, but as a place to navigate. The difference between a tourist and an intruder. The difference between curiosity and something that requires caution. The footprints were recent, not hours old, but maybe days, maybe less. I moved toward them, following their direction deeper into the factory floor. The light was dimmer here, away from the skylights. The machinery crowded closer together, creating passages and narrow corridors between the production lines. The air felt older here, somehow. The smell of coffee and fibers giving way to something mineral and deep, like opening a book whose pages had never been exposed to sunlight. And then I heard it, a sound from below. Mechanical, not the creak and shift of an old building settling, but an actual sound of machinery, a rhythmic mechanical pulse, like a heartbeat made of metal. It lasted for maybe 3 seconds, then stopped. I waited. The sound didn't return. The silence that followed felt deliberate, as if the factory had caught itself, realized it had made a sound it shouldn't have made, and gone still again. My hand moved instinctively to my camera, a professional instinct, a way of processing the moment through the lens instead of confronting it directly. But I didn't take a photo. Something about the gesture felt wrong. Instead, I stood there in the dimming light, listening to the weight of abandoned space, and tried to locate where the sound had come from. It had come from below. From the basement. The stairwell down was at the far end of the production floor, near what must have been an administrative area. A door marked B1 hung partially open, and the stairs beyond descended into a darkness that the factory's afternoon light refused to penetrate. I could see maybe 3 steps before the darkness took over completely. I didn't go down. Not yet. The prudent thing would have been to mark the location, come back with proper equipment, better light, a camera that could handle low light conditions. But as I stood there, looking at those stairs, I found myself thinking about the time cards again, about the coffee mugs with their evaporated contents, about the lunch pail that had never been opened, about someone who hadn't clocked out. I took 1 step toward the stairwell, then stopped. The sound didn't return, but the silence after the machinery had stopped. That silence had felt almost expectant, almost like the factory was waiting to see if I was coming down after all, like it was listening. I turned back toward the loading dock and the daylight beyond. I still had hours of usable light. There was the 2nd and 3rd floors to explore first, the administrative offices where decisions had been made, where the choice to close the factory would have been reflected in memos or records. The basement could wait. But I felt the pull of it as I walked away, a weight in the space behind me. The factory floor still smells like yesterday's shift, I thought, and something in that smell, in the preservation of that moment, felt less like abandonment and more like suspension, like the pause before the music starts again. The light from the loading dock was almost painful after the dimness of the production floor. I stepped out into the late afternoon, breathing air that moved, that wasn't trapped, that didn't carry the weight of something unfinished. My hands were steady. My pulse was normal. There was no rational reason for the unease that had settled behind my ribs. I told myself I would come back tomorrow, with better equipment, with daylight enough to explore properly, with a more scientific approach to what I'd found. But even as I walked back to my car, I knew I was lying to myself. I knew exactly why I would come back. And it wasn't the footprints, or the machinery in the basement, or even the time cards frozen in that moment of abandonment. It was the feeling that something down there had heard me, and that I'd be welcome when I returned. I came back 3 days later. Not tomorrow, as I'd promised myself. I couldn't. There was something in my routines that resisted it. I found reasons to delay. Work piled up. The weather turned bad. My car needed service. But underneath all of it was a simpler truth. I wasn't ready to go back immediately. Some part of me needed the distance, the time to convince myself that what I'd felt in that factory had been nothing more than the weight of an old building, the natural unease of being alone in a place designed for crowds. By the third day, the rationalizations had worn thin enough that I stopped fighting it. The drive took longer this time. The access road was harder to find. I'd somehow misremembered the turns, taken a fork that led nowhere before backtracking. When I finally reached the chain-link fence, I sat in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes, hands on the wheel, looking at the building's face. It looked smaller in full daylight, less imposing. The Victorian bones of the main structure were visible now, that old brick underneath the later additions of corrugated metal and aluminum siding. There were birds nesting in the upper windows. I could see the matted dark shapes of their nests from where I sat. A small, ordinary detail that made the place feel less threatening somehow. Wildlife had moved in. Life was reclaiming it. That was natural. That was how things worked. I grabbed my equipment bag, this time with a proper flashlight, extra batteries, a notebook, and approached the fence. The same gap where I'd entered before. The same smell when I stepped through. Rust and dust and something organic I still couldn't place. The loading dock doors were exactly as I'd left them. Slightly ajar, that wedge of darkness visible between them. But as I walked closer, I noticed something I didn't remember from the previous visit. There were marks on the concrete, scuff marks, as if something heavy had been dragged across the surface. The marks ran from the door opening toward the interior of the loading dock, and they looked recent. The edges were still relatively clean, not weeks old. I stood very still looking at them. It could have been anything. Debris settling, rats moving objects, the wind dragging something across the floor that day or the next. The cold season had passed. I'd checked the forecast. No storms. But something had moved here in the days I'd been gone. I pulled the loading dock door wider and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, stronger now, or perhaps I'd forgotten the precise weight of it. That layered smell of old machinery, dust, and something beneath it that I'd started to think of as the smell of time itself. The smell of years sitting still. But there was something else now, too. Something sharper. Something organic and slightly sweet that made the back of my neck prickle. The loading dock was dim without the afternoon sun cutting through the windows of the production floor. My flashlight beam cut a clean line through the dust, illuminating particles that hung in the air like the building was exhaling. I pointed the beam toward the scuff marks I'd seen outside. They continued into the darkness, heading toward the main factory floor. I followed them. The production floor was marginally lighter than I remembered. My eyes had adjusted, or perhaps the autumn sun was now at a different angle to the high windows. I could see the machinery in better detail. The conveyor belt system that stretched the length of the space like the spine of something skeletal. The workstations arranged in their neat rows, and the time clock still mounted on its wall, the pale cards still jutting from the slots like tongues. The scuff marks continued across the floor, weaving between the machinery with an almost deliberate quality. They led toward the center of the space, then seemed to stop near one of the large industrial presses, a hulking piece of equipment that squatted like a patient thing, waiting for hands that would never touch it again. I was pointing my flashlight toward the press when I heard the sound. It was a small sound. A tap. Single, metallic, it came from somewhere above me, and I jerked my head up so fast my neck cracked. The second and third floors loomed in the dimness of the upper space, their windows catching what light remained from the outside. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound didn't repeat. Just the building settling, I told myself. Metal contracting as the temperature dropped toward evening. The sound of a structure older than I was, holding itself together through sheer force of habit. But my hands were cold now, and it wasn't just from the temperature. I forced myself to examine the area around the press more carefully. There was nothing unusual, no debris that hadn't been there before. The scuff marks seemed to fade near the equipment, as if whatever had created them had been absorbed into the machinery itself. I was being absurd. I was reading meaning into coincidence. I walked deeper into the factory floor toward the stairwell that led to the administrative offices. The stairs were metal, and they rang under my footsteps with a sound that echoed through the space. It was oddly comforting, proof that I was here, that I was real, that the building was responding to my presence in normal mechanical ways. The second floor was a corridor lined with offices, small rooms with desks and filing cabinets, each one a particular type of preserved moment. I found myself drawn into these spaces, opening my flashlight beam into their dark corners. The first office had a calendar on the wall, still turned to the month the factory had closed. April, the days before the closure were marked through with a red pen as if someone had been counting down the hours. In another office, a desk held a nameplate, thin brass, just initials, AM. And below it, nothing, I found a coffee mug with a faded logo that might have been a union symbol. The mug was empty, but the interior wall still held the faint brown ring of decades-old coffee. There were personal photographs on some desks, images of people I would never identify, frozen in moments of happiness or at least the pretense of it, which was perhaps the same thing. By the time I'd moved through the third office, I realized my hands were shaking slightly. I told myself it was hunger. I'd skipped lunch. It was the staleness of the air in these closed rooms. It was the accumulation of small violations, opening these spaces, letting my presence into them. But deeper than that, I knew it was something else. It was the feeling that I was looking at something I shouldn't be looking at. Not a crime or a tragedy, but something close to it. Something personal and private that had been left behind by accident. I was turning to leave one of the offices when my flashlight caught something on the floor. A piece of paper. Recent, the edges were still white, not yellowed or curled with age. I picked it up. It was a printout, some kind of form or document, but the text was too small to read in the poor light. I held it closer to my flashlight. The paper was cold in my hand, colder than it should have been. The text was a work order. For maintenance, for operational inspection and system reset, and the date on it was yesterday. My mind moved slowly through the implications. Someone had been here. Someone had come into this building, had walked these corridors, had left this paper in an office where it could be found. But why? Who would schedule maintenance in an abandoned factory? What possible systems could need resetting? I pocketed the paper and made my way back to the stairwell. I was going to the basement. I wasn't planning to. The afternoon was already moving toward evening. and I'd told myself I would wait for better conditions. But that piece of paper had changed something. The factory was no longer a neutral space of archaeological interest. Someone else had been here recently. Someone had reasons to be here that they hadn't shared. The basement stairs were where I remembered them. Metal, descending into darkness, that smell of machine oil, and something else. Something that in the 3 days since I'd last been here might have grown stronger. Or perhaps my mind had simply constructed it from suggestion and expectation. I descended carefully, my flashlight ahead of me, and at the bottom of the stairs I stopped. Something was different. The machinery was still there, still dormant, still wearing its coating of dust. The footprints I'd seen before were still visible in the dust of the floor. But there were new prints now, multiple sets, overlapping, moving through the space with purpose. They led from the stairs toward the far wall, toward the section of machinery that I'd identified as the main power systems. And they stopped in front of a panel I definitely didn't remember seeing before. Or rather, I did remember it, I must have seen it, but it seemed fresher than the rest of the equipment. Cleaner, sections of it showed bare metal where the dust had been wiped away, deliberately, carefully, and the panel was open. There was a keypad visible inside, the kind that would have been used to input codes or authorize system functions. The metal around it showed no signs of age. And as I moved my flashlight across it, I realized why. The panel hadn't been opened in decades. It had been opened recently. Within the last few days, my breath came faster. I stood very still, listening. The factory was completely silent. No hum of residual power. No distant sounds from the town outside. Just the weight of the air and the dust hanging in my flashlight beam, and the terrible sense of standing in a space where something had moved deliberately, purposefully, leaving traces of its presence. I raised my flashlight higher, sweeping it across the rest of the basement, and that's when I saw something that stopped my heart entirely. On the far wall, written in dust on the concrete, were letters. Someone had drawn a finger through the accumulated grime and left a message. The letters were large, deliberate, and they read, "Welcome back. The cold of the basement seemed to deepen." I didn't remember that message from my previous visit. I would have remembered it. I would have seen it. I knew I would have, because there was no doubt in me anymore that it hadn't been there 3 days ago. It was fresh enough that I could see the trails where the dust had been displaced, could see the fingerprints in the residual grime that bordered the letters. Someone had been here. In the days I'd been away, someone had come into this factory. They had walked the production floor, left their footprints in the dust. They had read whatever had drawn me back, the time cards, the coffee mugs, the sense of an unfinished moment, and they had understood it meant I would return. And they had left a message. I was welcome. I climbed the basement stairs much faster than I'd descended them. My hands were no longer cold, they were hot, flushed with adrenaline, and I was breathing through my mouth because the air tasted wrong, tasted like metal and time and something else I still couldn't identify. By the time I reached the loading dock, I was moving through the space with minimal care for stealth or caution. I pushed through the doors, stepped out into the fading light of the parking lot, and didn't stop walking until I reached my car. I sat in the driver's seat with the doors locked, hands shaking against the steering wheel, and I tried to construct a rational explanation. Someone was using the factory. A transient, perhaps. someone who'd made a home in the building and who'd seen evidence of my previous visit. They'd left the message as a kind of greeting, a dark joke, or perhaps the expression of a lonely person's welcome to a stranger. It made sense. It was rational. It explained everything except for the maintenance order dated yesterday, except for the deliberately opened panel in the basement, except for the feeling that I was not looking at the residual activity of a person, but rather the orchestrated welcome of something that had been waiting for my return. I started the car and drove out of the parking lot without looking back at the building. But I knew, as I navigated the dark road back toward town, that I would return again, that the factory had extended its invitation, and I'd already accepted it whether I'd meant to or not. The welcome written in dust on a basement wall wasn't a warning or a threat. It was a promise. And something in me, something I couldn't name or explain, had already decided to keep it. Hashtag the factory floor still smells like yesterday's shift. Part 3, I lasted 4 days before I went back. 4 days of trying to construct a life around the knowledge that something in that factory understood I existed. 4 days of pretending that whatever lived in those concrete spaces and empty corridors hadn't already marked me as something belonging to it. 4 days of driving past the access road 17 times, I counted, before finally turning the wheel onto it again. The rational mind is a fragile thing. It builds walls out of explanation and logic, and then one small thing penetrates those walls and they crumble to dust. In my case, it was the dreams. The first night I dreamed I was walking through the factory in the dark, not exploring anymore, but moving with purpose, my feet knowing the path without my eyes to guide them. I could see nothing, but I could hear the machinery, not running, but settling, cooling, the metal contracting and expanding with soft groaning sounds that almost resembled breath. The air was thick, with the smell of machine oil and something sweet underneath, like fruit left too long in the sun. I was walking toward something. I didn't know what, but I was walking toward it with the certainty of a salmon swimming upstream, an instinct older than thought. I woke up gasping. The second night the dream was different. I was in the basement again, standing before the wall with the message. But this time, as I watched, the dust was moving. Something was writing across the concrete with invisible fingers, adding to the message letter by letter. Welcome back became welcome back come deeper, each new word forming in the grime like insects crawling into a pattern. The third night, I didn't dream at all. I just lay awake, listening to the silence of my apartment, and by morning I knew I couldn't stay away anymore. The not knowing had become worse than anything I might discover. The factory had gotten into my head the way certain songs do. A melody you can't stop humming, the kind that wakes you at 3 in the morning and won't let you sleep until you've heard it again. I told myself I was going back for answers. The truth was simpler. I was going back because something in that place had decided I belonged there, and the part of me that still thought it had a choice had already started to shrink away. I arrived at the factory as the sun was bleeding into the horizon, turning the sky the color of a bruise. The parking lot was empty, as it always was. I parked in the same spot, sat in the car for a moment, and then, without allowing myself to hesitate, I got out and walked toward the main entrance. The loading dock doors were still broken. I pushed through them without calling out, without announcing myself. The factory interior was transitioning into darkness, and I switched on my flashlight before I'd taken more than a few steps. The beam carved a tunnel through the dust-laden air, illuminating particles that hung suspended like something drowning in light. The production floor stretched out before me exactly as I'd left it. The machine stood silent. The catwalks rose into shadow. The time cards were still there in their slots, still marking hours that no one had ever worked. But there was a difference now, a presence I hadn't noticed before, or perhaps hadn't wanted to notice. It was in the air itself, a density that made breathing feel like an effort, as if the space was thickening around me, growing heavier with every second I stood in it. I made my way deeper into the factory, toward the stairs that led to the basement. I didn't need the rational explanations anymore. I'd stopped constructing them on the drive over. Whatever was going to happen, whatever I was going to find, I'd accepted it with a decision that felt less like choice and more like surrender. The basement stairs descended in darkness, and I went down them carefully, one hand trailing along the wall. The temperature dropped with each step, until my breath came out in small clouds. At the bottom, I swept my flashlight across the concrete floor. The footprints were still there, the ones from my previous visit, but there were new ones now, overlapping them, circling through the space in patterns I couldn't quite follow. They weren't random. They had purpose. They formed concentric circles that seemed to radiate from the far wall, the wall with the message. I walked toward it slowly, my footsteps echoing in the small space. The message had changed. Welcome back was still there, but the letters had been added to, extended, until they formed something longer. I raised my flashlight, and the beam caught the words. Welcome back, you were always meant to return. The letters seemed deeper now, pressed more forcefully into the dust, as if whoever had written them was pressing harder, trying to ensure the message would last. I could see fingerprints everywhere, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, overlapping each other until they formed a kind of abstract texture across the wall. Some of them looked fresh. I'd come alone. The realization hit me with the weight of absolute certainty. I'd come alone, and yet there were dozens of handprints on this wall. Recent ones. The dust around them hadn't had time to resettle. I turned around, my flashlight beam suddenly feeling inadequate, barely reaching the shadows that had accumulated in the corners of the basement. I was alone down here. I was certain of it. But I was also certain I wasn't alone at all. Hello? My voice sounded small, almost childlike. Is someone here? The air didn't change. The temperature didn't shift. But something in the darkness seemed to listen, seemed to turn its attention toward me the way a head might turn when it hears its name called. I climbed the basement stairs without running. Running felt dangerous, like it might trigger something. My legs wanted to run, wanted to move fast, but I forced them to maintain a steady pace. Down the length of the production floor, past the machines that seemed to track my progress with their motionless eyes. Through the loading dock doors, pushing hard, stepping out into the cooling evening. This time, I did look back at the building. The factory stood against the darkening sky like something that had never been alive and never would be. But inside it, somewhere in the spaces between the machines and along the basement walls, something was watching me leave. I felt it the way you feel a gaze, that primitive part of your brain that knows when it's being observed, when something has focused its attention on you with singular purpose. I sat in my car and started the engine, and as I began to drive toward the access road, I felt something else, a certainty that I had passed a threshold I couldn't uncross, not just by returning to the factory, but by seeing the handprints, by understanding that whatever was there, whatever had been waiting in those spaces, was no longer content with leaving messages in dust. It had acknowledged my arrival in a different way. It had answered me. My phone buzzed as I pulled onto the main road. A text message from an unknown number. No words, just an image. A photograph of me, taken from inside the factory, from somewhere in the darkness. A photograph of me standing in the basement, looking at the wall with the message, my face captured in the beam of my own flashlight. Taken from behind. From somewhere I hadn't thought to look. I didn't show the photograph to anyone. I didn't report it. I told myself there was no one to report it to. No explanation that wouldn't sound like the thoughts of someone losing their mind. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. I was afraid that if I spoke about it to anyone else, if I let the factory's existence into another person's knowledge, then the invitation it had extended would expand. It would become a wider thing, an open door. So I kept it to myself, and I drove home through the gathering dark, and I knew with the certainty of someone who has made a decision they didn't know they were making that I would go back again. The factory had called me by name, not with words, but with proof, with purpose, with the deliberate act of tracking me, of watching me, of acknowledging that I had heard its welcome and was expected to respond. And something in me, something that had been waking up since the moment I'd first walked through those loading dock doors, was already composing its answer. Hashtag Part 4. Aftermath, the photograph existed in a space between real and impossible. I kept it in my phone, in a folder I created specifically for it, unable to delete it and unable to show it to anyone. I would open it at odd moments, standing in line at a grocery store, waiting for coffee, sitting at my desk at work, and stare at the grain and shadow, trying to extract something from it that might make sense. The image showed me from behind, my shoulders hunched slightly, the beam of my flashlight pointing at something I couldn't see in the photograph itself. But I could remember what I'd been looking at. The wall, the handprints. The single word that I had by then convinced myself I might have misread entirely. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. The world continued in the way that the world does, indifferent to the fact that something had shifted in mine. I went to work. I saw friends. I had conversations about weather and traffic and small inconveniences that felt increasingly hollow, performed by someone wearing my skin. There was a version of me that existed on the surface of things, and there was another version that remained in the basement of that factory, standing in the dark, waiting to understand what it had been asked to do. I didn't go back immediately. I didn't drive past the factory or scout the surrounding roads or do any of the things that a rational person would have recognized as obsessive behavior. Instead, I waited. I let the seed that had been planted grow in its own time, in the darkness of my thoughts. But waiting is not the same as inaction. In the spaces between sleep and waking, I found myself mentally mapping the factory again. The loading dock, the production floor, the staircase, the basement. I traced routes through the building in my mind, planning not for what I would do, but for where I would go, what I would look for. The photograph was unsigned. The number it came from never responded to texts, never sent anything else. I checked my car for tracking devices, a thought that came to me in the early morning hours, the kind of clarity that only arrives when you're teetering on the edge of certainty and madness. There was nothing. No device, no GP's tag, no explanation for how someone or something had followed me to my car and sent an image of my own back to myself from a phone number that belonged to no one. Work became difficult in ways that were hard to articulate to anyone who might have asked. I couldn't concentrate. I would find myself staring at documents without reading them, my eyes moving across the words while my mind was elsewhere. My supervisor pulled me aside after a video call where I'd apparently forgotten to unmute myself while I left the desk. "Everything okay?" she asked. The kind of question people ask when they don't really want to know the answer. "Fine," I said, "just tired." It was true. I was tired. But it was a different kind of tiredness than the ordinary exhaustion of someone sleeping poorly. It was the tiredness of existing in two places at once, of being divided, of carrying something inside myself that was growing larger, heavier, taking up more space with each passing day. My apartment began to feel small in a new way, not claustrophobic, but insufficient. The space seemed too bright, too orderly, too removed from something that I couldn't name. I found myself drawn to the basement of my own building at odd hours, not with any particular purpose, but simply to be in a dimmer place, a quieter place, a space that felt closer to the frequency of my own thoughts. The building superintendent gave me a strange look one night when he saw me standing near the water heater at 2 a.m, just standing there in the dark, not looking for anything, not fixing anything, just being. "Can't sleep?" he asked, and I realized how it must have looked. "Couldn't find a light switch," I lied. The lie came easily. I was becoming fluent in small deceptions, the kind that are so minor they barely register as dishonesty. They were necessary. They were the only way to keep the two versions of myself from colliding, the surface version and the deeper one. 5 weeks after the photograph, I received an email. The subject line was empty. The message contained nothing but an address, not the factory, but a place nearby, something I didn't immediately recognize. It took me several minutes of searching before I realized it was a residential address, an old house about 2 miles from the factory on a road I'd driven past many times. The email came from the same unknown number, now sending messages through a platform that left no digital trail, no way to track the sender. I didn't forward the email to anyone. I didn't print it out. I committed the address to memory and deleted it, watching it move to trash, then deleting it again from there, as if the additional act of removal might erase the knowledge itself. It didn't. The address stayed with me. It became a weight in my pocket, not physical, but present, something I could feel without touching it. My hands knew that route. My car could drive it without my conscious direction. I didn't allow myself to follow the route, but I could feel it there, waiting, available, the way a word hovers at the edge of your mind trying to surface, and you know that speaking it will change something. July began with heat that settled over the city like a visible thing, and I noticed something small and quiet that almost went unnoticed. I had stopped looking at other people the same way. When I passed someone on the street, I would catch myself trying to see what was behind them. Not in a paranoid way, exactly, but with an awareness that there might be something just beyond the edge of their peripheral vision, something they hadn't noticed yet, something that was learning how to follow us, learning our patterns, learning where we went in the dark. I wondered if they could feel it the way I could feel it. That primitive awareness, that sense of being observed. It was on a Tuesday evening, while I was making dinner in my apartment, that I found the handprint. It was small, barely 3 inches across, pressed into the dust on top of my refrigerator, a place so unlikely, so impossible to reach without significant effort, that for a moment I convinced myself I was hallucinating it. I touched it carefully. The dust came away on my fingers. The impression remained. The negative space of a hand that had been small enough to fit in my palm, small enough that I couldn't immediately place how a person could have made it. It was too high. The angle was wrong. The apartment had been locked. I cleaned it away carefully as if removing evidence, but I already knew that removing evidence wouldn't matter. It was message enough just knowing where it had been placed. It was message enough knowing that something had moved through my private space, had stood on top of him. The deeper I moved into the factory, the more the air seemed to thicken around me. It wasn't humidity. The concrete was too old and porous to hold moisture like that. It was something else. A density, a weight that had settled over decades and simply never lifted. My footsteps echoed wrong, not in the way you'd expect from an empty building. The sound seemed to arrive a fraction of a second too late, as if the space itself was considering whether to return it to me. I stopped walking just to listen to the silence that followed. It pressed against my eardrums in a way that made me swallow hard. The factory floors stretched before me in sections, each one marked by the ghosts of machinery. I could see the rectangular shadows on the concrete, where something heavy had stood for so long that the surrounding stone had weathered differently, darker, stained by oil and time and the simple fact of presence. The shadows were sharper than the rest of the floor, almost aggressive in their definition. Looking at them felt like looking at an absence made visible. Sunlight filtered through the high windows in columns of amber. The dust inside those columns moved in ways that didn't follow any breeze I could feel. Patterns that seemed almost deliberate. I watched one column for longer than I should have, waiting for it to shift toward me or away. It did neither. It simply continued its slow internal motion, suspended in light that hadn't changed its angle in what felt like hours. The smell intensified as I stood there. I've tried to describe it to people since, and the closest I can come is this. Imagine breathing in the memory of work. Sweat-stained concrete, the copper undertone of machinery, rubber that had degraded into something chemical and wrong. But beneath all of that, something organic, something that suggested that the building itself was slowly decomposing, breaking down into component parts with no one to witness the process. The smell wasn't fresh. It wasn't recent. It was the accumulated exhalation of a structure that had been left to age without the dignity of collapse. I moved toward one of the workstations. The table was metal, painted industrial gray, and its surface was covered in a fine dust so uniform that it looked intentional, like someone had carefully laid a sheet across it and it had simply never been disturbed. I reached out to touch it, and my finger left a trail that looked obscene. The dust beneath was darker. Older, I pulled my hand back. On the wall behind the station, Someone had written something, not recently. The chalk or paint had faded until it was barely visible, just a suggestion of letters and numbers. I couldn't read it. I didn't try very hard. There was something in the fact of it being there, a human gesture, a mark made by someone trying to impose order or meaning on their day. That felt more disturbing than silence would have. They had stood here. They had made this mark. And now there was no one here at all. The light continued to move through the windows without actually changing. That's when I realized I'd been standing in one spot for far longer than I thought. The dust on my shoes had begun to accumulate in a way that suggested time was passing differently here. Thicker, slower, more present. I became aware of my own breathing. It sounded small in this space. Not loud, but notably small. As if the factory was demonstrating just how little I occupied, how easily this place could exist without me. I tried to breathe more quietly, but that only made me more aware of my heartbeat, which seemed to be finding a rhythm that matched something else in the building. Something I couldn't quite identify but could absolutely feel. The shadows of the window frames lay across the floor like a calendar, time marked in geometry, and I was standing in one of the squares, watching it begin to shift toward evening, understanding only then that I should have left hours ago. Why refrigerator had reached up that high from somewhere I couldn't see, from somewhere I couldn't have looked, and had touched a place where I would eventually find it. The visit meant something different than the factory visits. The factory was a place of transit, a space between worlds. But my apartment was home. The refrigerator was where I kept the things I needed to survive, the small necessities of living. To reach above it, to place a hand there and leave a mark, it wasn't a warning. It was something closer to intimacy. It was something that said, I know where you rest. I know where you store the things that sustain you. I have been in the spaces above your head. I didn't look for other handprints. I didn't examine the apartment for signs of intrusion. To do so would be to extend an acknowledgement that I wasn't ready to give. But I slept differently after that. I slept with one part of my awareness always alert, always aware of the ceiling, always aware of the space above me in the darkness, always aware of the possibility that something was there, patient, waiting for me to understand what I'd already been told. The factory had not called me back, but it didn't need to. It had already come to me, had already crossed the threshold of my own space, had already transformed the private geography of my life into something shared. And I understood in the way that understanding comes without words or explanation that this was how it worked. This was the progression. First, the message in dust, then the acknowledgement, then the visit, then the slow transformation of one's own space into something that belonged to something else, something that was both outside and inside, something that was patient and present, and completely, utterly aware of exactly who I was. I haven't gone back to the factory, not yet, but I know that I will, and I know that when I do, I will go not as a visitor, but as something returning home, to a place that has been waiting for me not with hostility, but with a kind of careful, deliberate attention. The attention of something that has learned my shape, my rhythm, my particular frequency, and has decided that I fit into something larger than I had understood myself to be. The address sits in my memory like a door I haven't opened. The photograph exists in my phone like a reminder that I'm never truly alone, never truly unseen. And on my refrigerator, I've placed a small decoration, a wooden piece that my mother gave me years ago, something I'd forgotten about until now. I positioned it carefully over the spot where the handprint was found, not because I'm hiding something, but because I'm keeping something safe, keeping it close, keeping it warm, the way you keep a secret in the dark, the way you hold something precious that isn't yours, the way you prepare yourself for the moment when whatever you've been waiting for finally asks you to answer, and you find yourself saying yes before you even understand the question. Story 2. I found my name carved into the abandoned well. The valley doesn't change, but it ages. That's what struck me most when I turned down the old road. The way decay moves so slowly, you can almost pretend it isn't happening until you stop looking away. I hadn't been back here in 15 years. That was deliberate at first, then it became a habit. Then it became the kind of thing you don't question anymore. You just stay away. But the letter from the property company had forced my hand. They wanted to know if I had any interest in the land before they assessed it for development. My family's land. Which meant nothing to me, except that it still existed somewhere, waiting. The driveway was barely visible now. What had once been gravel was mostly overgrown. Pale earth and wild grass pushing through cracks that had spread like veins across the hardpack. The mailbox still stood at the mouth of the drive. No door, no numbers, just the wooden post weathered to something like bone. The farmstead sat in a hollow about a quarter-mile in, nestled into the slope where the valley folded inward. The house I'd grown up in was still there, still standing, which surprised me. The barn beside it had begun its final collapse years ago. The roof sagged in the middle now like something breathing its last breaths. But the house held its shape, even if the paint had surrendered completely and the porch had settled into angles that didn't quite make sense anymore. I parked near the tree line and walked the rest. It was late afternoon, that particular time in early autumn when the light turns honey gold and everything looks like it's drowning in old time. The grass came up to my shins in places. Insects moved through it in waves, grasshoppers mostly, their bodies flicking away from my steps. The air was thick with the smell of things decomposing in the heat, not unpleasant exactly, just heavy. My mother had died here. Not in the house. She'd managed to get herself to a hospital in town for that. But the sickness that took her had started here, grown here, become undeniable here. The farm had been her whole life before cancer made even that impossible to sustain. My father had been gone long before I was old enough to really know it. So it was just my mother and me in this hollow, in this house, until suddenly it wasn't. After that, my aunt had handled everything. The property had been left to me, but there was no money for property taxes that didn't come from letting the land sit empty. At some point, my aunt had made an arrangement with one of those land management companies. I didn't have to think about it anymore, except for letters like the one that had arrived last week. The well was beyond the barn, in what had once been a more deliberate yard space. I could see the stone rim from the house, that pale gray circle that had seemed impossibly deep to me as a child. The wooden cover had been there then, sturdy, the kind of thing that could kill you if you weren't careful. "Don't go near that," my mother had said once, and I'd listened mostly walking toward it now. I felt something I couldn't quite name, not quite dread, more like the muscle memory of it. Some part of me remembered the weight of being near that well, the sense of standing at the edge of something deep. The wooden cover was mostly gone now. What remained was brittle, fragmented into pieces that seemed to have given up the basic structural integrity required to be a board anymore. The stone rim was exposed where weather had worn away mortar and moss grew thick on the northern side. There was something almost peaceful about it, the way ruins are peaceful when enough time has passed that you're not afraid anymore. You're just observing the fact of deterioration. I stepped closer. The opening dropped away into blackness. I couldn't see water. I couldn't see anything but the graduated shade shift from pale stone to absolute dark. The air rising from it was cool and carried something ancient, not quite musty, but like the breath of something that had been underground so long it had forgotten what fresh air smelled like. That's when I noticed the carvings. They covered the top rim in scattered marks. Initials, mostly names, the usual ephemera of human presence, proof that people had stood here, pressed stone against stone, and left themselves behind. Kids' work probably, local teenagers over decades, maybe over generations. But one set of marks caught my eye because the stone around it was damaged in a particular way. The letters were deep, much deeper than the others, rough, like whoever had made them had worked with real intention, real pressure. M.R., my initials. Morgan Riley. I knelt down. The stone was cool through the fabric of my jeans. The marks were old enough to have gathered some weathering, but not so old that the edges had rounded to nothing. Years old, definitely, but not decades. This was relatively recent damage in the timeline of stone. The handwriting style, if you could call scratches in stone handwriting, was familiar in a way that made my stomach turn. Not because it was mine, but because I had no memory of making it. I would remember this. I would remember kneeling here, finding something sharp, pressing it against stone with enough force to leave a mark this deep. That's not the kind of thing you do without remembering it. But the initials were there, undeniably there, carved in my handwriting or something so close to it that my mind couldn't find a difference. I stood up too quickly. The afternoon light was already beginning to turn, that golden hour fading toward something more gray. The shadows under the barn's remaining structure had gotten longer. The insects in the grass made a sound like distant static. When I looked back at the well, I realized there was something else I'd missed. There was a gap between two of the larger stones that made up the rim, a crevice maybe 2 inches wide, dark inside, and wedged in that gap, so close to the well's edge that I would never have noticed it if I hadn't been standing directly over it, was something white. Paper, folded paper, yellowed at the edges, sitting in that crack like something had been deliberately placed there, deliberately hidden, or deliberately preserved. My hand reached for it before my brain caught up with what I was doing. The paper was brittle, the kind of fragile that comes from years of damp and heat cycling through exposed places. As I unfolded it, pieces of the outer edge crumbled between my fingers. It was a journal entry, written in pen and handwriting I recognized as my own. The date at the top was written in my hand, too, 15 years ago, almost to the day. The entry was short, not filled with words, but heavy somehow. It read, "I came here again today. Don't know why. Don't know what I'm looking for anymore. The well is so much deeper than I remember. How can something be deeper than you remember it? But standing here, I feel like I could fall in and never stop falling. Like the bottom isn't a real place anymore, or maybe it never was. Everything falls differently when you're not watching. I cut myself on the stone. Stupid, there's blood on my hand. It's already drying. I won't come back here. But I know I will. The paper shook in my hands. Not from fear, not yet. From the simple, cold knowledge that I had no memory of writing this. No memory of the well seeming deeper. No memory of bleeding. No memory of whatever state I'd been in that would make me write something like that. No memory of standing here, in this exact place 15 years ago, trying to understand why I was drawn to a well that terrified me. 15 years of my life, and there was a blank space where this should have been. I looked down at my palm, turning my hand over, examining the surface. No scar, nothing, but there was a thin line of blood under the nail of my middle finger, fresh, like I'd scratched myself recently, or like it had never quite stopped bleeding in the first place. The light was definitely fading now. The honey gold had turned to something more like rust. The barn cast a long shadow that seemed to reach across the yard toward where I stood. I should leave. The rational part of me, the part that still believed in rational things, was already moving toward that decision. But before I could fold the paper back up, before I could step away from the well, something made me look down at the rim one more time. The carvings were still there. M.R., deep and rough and absolutely mine. But beside them, in the stone right next to those initials, were new scratches. Scratch marks that hadn't been there 2 minutes ago. Pale stone dust still clung to the edges, still settling, still fresh, still wet looking in the fading light. Someone had been carving while I stood there. The yard was empty. The barn was empty. The grass swayed with no wind I could feel. The line of trees that bordered the property stood dark and still, and beyond them nothing moved. I held the journal entry in one hand, the paper already beginning to curl again, already trying to remember how to fall apart. And I understood, with the kind of clarity that doesn't feel like understanding at all, but like remembering something I'd always known, I was not alone at this well. I had never been alone at this well. The question was only which version of alone that meant. Hashtag I found my name carved into the abandoned well. Part 2, I backed away from the well slowly, not running, not quite willing to turn my back on it completely. The paper crinkled in my grip. My phone was in my jacket pocket, though I hadn't thought to check the time or even whether there was signal out here. The sun was dropping fast now, that particular speed that late autumn has. As if the day itself was losing its grip and sliding toward dark. The barn loomed to my left. I'd passed it on the way in without really seeing it, the way you don't really see things when you're focused on something else. Now, I saw it, the weathered boards, the gaps where wood had warped and split, the door hanging at an angle that suggested it had been that way for years. Decades, the kind of place that had already surrendered to time. I kept walking toward the fence line, toward the overgrown driveway that would take me back to my car. My breathing had settled, though my hands hadn't stopped trembling. The rational explanation was simple enough. I'd seen the scratches before and forgotten. The mind plays tricks in places like this. Places with weight, places with history carved into their surfaces. But I knew that wasn't true. I knew what I'd seen, or rather, what I'd seen appear. The path back took me past the eastern corner of the property, where the forest crept closest to the clearing. The trees were mostly bare by now, their branches like 100 sketched hands reaching toward whatever light remained. I could see deeper into the woods than I would have been able to in summer, deeper into that private darkness where things don't need to hide, because the forest does it for them. I was maybe 30 feet from the fence when I heard the sound. Not a snap, not quite a crack. Something between the two, the sound of weight shifting on old wood. The kind of sound a barn makes when the wind moves through its gaps and presses against its frame. Except there was no wind. I'd already noticed the stillness. The air hung around me like held breath. I stopped walking. Turned, the barn door, the one that had been hanging open, was moving. Just slightly. Just enough that I could see the change in the angle. The shift in the gap between door and frame. It swung inward maybe 6 inches, then stopped. The hinges didn't squeal. There was no sound at all, which somehow made it worse than if there had been. Then it swung back, slowly, to where it had been before. I stood there watching. The sky had turned from rust to something closer to brown. In a few minutes it would be fully dark, the kind of dark that forests create, where the distinction between shadow and actual absence becomes theoretical. Someone lives here, I thought. That was the explanation. Someone lives in that barn or nearby, and they'd seen me poking around near the well. A caretaker, maybe, or someone squatting. Or just someone who'd decided to make their home in a place that had already been abandoned by everyone else. That explanation felt good in my throat. I held on to it like something solid. I didn't call out. I didn't ask if anyone was there. Instead, I walked faster toward the fence, and then I was through it. There was a gap where the wire had rusted through. And I was moving down the overgrown drive toward where I'd left my car on the side of the road. The drive was longer than I remembered. Everything looked different in the failing light, stretched and unfamiliar. Trees that I'd walked past without noticing now seemed to lean toward the path, their branches low enough to brush my shoulders. My jacket caught on something, a thorn probably, or a sharp branch, and I pulled free without stopping. My car was still there. Silver, ordinary, real. I got in and locked the doors immediately, though the gesture felt almost performative. If something wanted to get in a car, locked doors wouldn't stop it. But the habit is strong, and I needed the habit right now. I needed normal things done in normal ways. I didn't look back at the property as I drove away. I drove past the dead mailbox, past the section of road where the asphalt had started to crack, past the place where the forest began to thin and release its grip on the road. Only when I was back on the main highway, with lights from oncoming traffic and the occasional lit window of a house, did I let my shoulders drop. But I knew I would go back. That was the thing I didn't tell myself, not directly. But I knew it the way you know things that terrify you with absolute certainty. I didn't go back for 2 weeks. In that time, I did what people do. I worked. I had conversations. I existed in the normal world. The world where things like abandoned wells and inexplicable scratches were aberrations, anomalies that didn't fit into the regular pattern of things. But the journal entry was still there. I'd scanned it, kept the image on my phone, and then I'd put the paper itself in a drawer where I wouldn't have to look at it. The problem was that not looking at it didn't make it disappear. Not looking at it just meant it took up space in a different way. I started researching the property, public records, property tax information. The internet remembers things that people try to forget, though usually not in the way they'd prefer. The land had been in my family's name, my grandmother's name, until 1987. That was 15 years before I went back to the well. That was the year I would have been 3 years old. The sale had been quick, the documentation minimal. Sold to a holding company with an address in a city 3 hours away. That holding company had gone dormant in 1993. There were no records of anyone living on the property after that. No one. For 30 years, no one. But people don't just disappear from places without leaving traces. There are utility records, trespassing incidents, neighbors who notice things. I called the county assessor's office. The woman on the phone had the particular patience of someone who'd explained the same thing many times before. The property is assessed as vacant and overgrown, she said. Taxes have been paid by the holding company every year. As far as the county is concerned, it's maintained but uninhabited. Has anyone reported concerns, I asked? Squatters? Or anyone living there illegally? There was a pause while she searched the system. Nothing in the last 15 years. There was one incident in 2008. Someone reported seeing lights on the property at night, but when officers went out to investigate, they found nothing. No one had been there. Building was still empty. The conversation stayed with me, lights at night, officers finding nothing. A barn door that swung open and closed on its own. An answer to a question I hadn't asked yet, carved into stone that should have been empty. By the time 2 weeks had passed, I wasn't even pretending that I wouldn't go back. I was just deciding when. I chose a Saturday. Daylight, though the days were getting shorter, were getting stingier with their light. I told myself I was doing this methodically. I would walk the property more thoroughly. I would check the barn, the house, any other structure. I would look for evidence of habitation, recent garbage, signs of occupation, anything that would explain what I'd seen, what I'd experienced. I was starting to think of it that way. Not what I'd seen, which implies observation, but something that had happened to me. Something that had involved me directly. I packed a flashlight, a digital camera, my phone. I wore shoes with good traction. I told no one where I was going. The drive back to the property felt shorter this time, as if the road itself had adjusted to my having traveled it before. The familiar markers appeared in sequence. The dead mailbox, the place where the forest thickened, the turn onto the long driveway. The barn was the first thing I noticed when I pulled up. The door was open, all the way open now, pulled back to its hinges, leaving the interior exposed to the gray afternoon light. In the 2 weeks since I'd last been here, the door had swung from hanging crooked to standing wide. I sat in my car for a long time, hands on the steering wheel, looking at that open door. Then I got out. The property was quieter than it had been before, but that might have been because I was more aware of the quiet now, more conscious of what its absence meant. No birds, no distant traffic. Even the wind, when I felt it cross my face, seemed muffled, as if the forest was absorbing sound rather than transmitting it. I walked toward the barn first. Part of me wanted to check the well, to see if there were more scratches, if the carving had continued without me. But I forced myself toward the larger mystery first. The barn, the open door, the place where weight had shifted in the absence of wind. The interior was almost empty. A few tools hung on the walls, a rusted rake, a shovel with a cracked handle, things that had been abandoned so long they'd become fixtures. The ground was dirt and scattered hay, and there were marks in the hay, recent marks by the look of them. Disturbances, something had been moving around inside, or someone had been inside. The difference felt important but unclear. I walked through the barn, my footsteps loud in the enclosed space. There was a door at the far end that led toward the back of the property, and when I pushed it open, I found myself looking at a section of the woods that I hadn't explored before. But I did see something else. About 10 feet from the barn's back entrance, the ground had been cleared. Not cleared exactly, disturbed. The vegetation had been pushed aside. No, not pushed, worn away. A path that led into the trees, worn down by repeated footsteps, the earth darker and more compact than the rest of the overgrown area. I stood there, looking at those footprints, and felt something shift in my chest. Not fear exactly, not yet, but recognition. The awareness of being on the edge of something, standing at the threshold where unknowing becomes knowing. I didn't follow the path, not yet. Instead, I went back to the well. The sun was lower now, maybe 2 hours from truly setting. That particular time of day when light becomes precious and shadows start to have weight. I approached the well carefully, as if it might move or change if I wasn't paying attention. The new scratches were still there, but there were more of them now. Not just scratches. Letters, rough, uneven, but unmistakable. Carved into the stone right next to my initials, right in the place where nothing had been 2 weeks ago. Stay. A single word, 5 letters carved deep into the stone of the well, deep enough that moss and lichen hadn't begun to grow in the marks yet. Recent, very recent. Recent enough that I could have watched it being made if I'd stood here in the past 2 weeks, if I'd been patient enough to wait for whatever carved in darkness and absence to carve its demands into the waking world. My hands were shaking. I took out my phone and photographed it. The flash went off, bright and harsh, and in that moment of sudden light I could see my own shadow stretched long across the ground, stretched thin and wrong, stretched in a direction that didn't match where the sun was. When I looked up from my phone, someone was standing by the tree line. Not standing exactly. Present there, in the way that things are present in your peripheral vision, at the edge of what you can see clearly. Human-shaped, but the shape wasn't quite right. Too tall, maybe, or the proportions were wrong. The way that things are wrong in dreams when you notice too late that something has 6 fingers or the light falls upward. I looked directly at it. The figure didn't move, didn't disappear, didn't become clearer or more defined. It remained in that space between certainty and imagination, real enough to be there, but not real enough to be unambiguously present, real enough that I knew with absolute certainty that it was looking at me. Then I blinked, and it was gone. Not gone as in it left. Gone as in the space where it had been was simply empty, and I couldn't remember if it had ever been filled. I backed away from the well, backing toward my car. My legs didn't quite believe in normal movement. Everything felt like it was happening in translation, like I was receiving the information about my own body secondhand. I made it to my car, got in, sat with my hands on the steering wheel, not moving, for what might have been 5 minutes or 20. Time felt negotiable. Then I drove away. This time I didn't speed. I didn't look in the mirror. I just drove, and let the forest recede, and let the property sink back into being a place that existed mostly in absence. But I knew the word was still there, still carved, still waiting, and I knew, with the kind of knowledge that doesn't require explanation or proof, that it wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. It was a promise that I had already made 15 years ago when I carved something else into that stone, something I couldn't remember. It was telling me what I'd asked for, what I'd wanted so badly that I'd driven back to understand it. The question was only what I was willing to sacrifice to find out what came next. I tried to go about my life normally. I told myself it was possible. For 3 days, I didn't think about the well. Or rather, I thought about it constantly, but with a methodical kind of detachment, the way you might catalog a recurring dream without letting it bleed into waking hours. I went to work. I answered emails. I sat in meetings about quarterly projections and nodded at appropriate intervals. The world continued its ordinary turning, indifferent to wells and words carved into stone. But on the 4th day, I found the message on my mirror. It was written in condensation. Stay, again the same 5 letters, except this time the message was backwards, written from behind the glass. From a position that would have required someone to stand on the other side of the mirror, outside of where mirrors lead to, and right through the surface itself. I wiped it away. My hand came back slick with something that wasn't water. It was too thick, too present, like touching something that had weight and intention. The mark reappeared within an hour. I covered the mirror with a sheet. That night I dreamed of wells, except they weren't empty. They were full of something that moved like water, but wasn't water. Something that rose and fell with its own breathing. I woke at 3:47 and knowing that something in the dream was still happening, somewhere nearby. The certainty was absolute. It wasn't intuition or fear-induced paranoia. It was the same knowledge that told me my heart was beating, that I was breathing. Biological fact. But for something else. The next morning, I found my car keys on the kitchen counter, arranged in the shape of an arrow, pointing outward, pointing toward the road that led to the property. I didn't remember putting them there. I live alone. I have always lived alone, which suddenly felt like important information, a thing I should hold on to carefully. I got in my car anyway. The drive took longer than it should have. The road twisted in directions I didn't remember, and I passed landmarks that seemed both familiar and impossible. A mailbox painted red standing in the middle of nowhere. Had that been there before? A house with all its windows boarded over, set back from the road, watching. These places flickered in and out of my attention like they existed only when I wasn't looking directly at them. By the time I reached the property, the sun was already beginning its descent. I hadn't intended to arrive at dusk. I hadn't intended to arrive at all, and yet here I was, parking in the same spot. My hands moving through the familiar motions of turning off the engine, stepping out, breathing the air that smelled like old stone and rot and seasons folding into one another. The well was waiting. The messages had multiplied. Not just on the stone around the rim, they were everywhere now. Stay was carved into the wood of the surrounding structure, deep gouges that looked fresh, that looked like they'd been made in fury or desperation. More messages spiraled down into the darkness below. I could see them in the diminishing light. Words carved by something that never needed to pause or reconsider, that worked with terrible purpose and endless time. And my initials, the ones I'd carved 15 years ago, they were wrong now. They'd changed. They read not as my name, but as something else. Something that looked like my handwriting but inverted, like a photograph of a photograph, familiar but irreversibly altered. I felt the presence before I saw it, not the human-shaped thing from before. This was something else, something that had weight and intention and a terrible kind of patience. It didn't arrive, it simply became evident that it had always been there, waiting in the spaces between trees, in the darkness that hadn't yet fully become night, in the places my eyes slid away from. I could feel it observing me, could feel the weight of its attention like pressure against my chest. When I looked down, there was mud on my shoes. But it wasn't mud. It was the same substance from my mirror, the not water, thick and present and somehow warm. And it was spreading in a pattern across the ground, and I realized with a kind of detached horror that it was tracing a path from the well's rim directly to where I was standing, a path that something had taken to reach me, or that I had taken, in a time I couldn't quite remember. The light was almost gone now. In the dimming, everything looked less distinct, more uncertain. The forest began to move, or rather to reveal that it had always been moving, that the trees swayed with a rhythm I couldn't hear but could feel in my teeth. Behind me something shifted in the darkness of the well. A sound came from below. Not a scream, not a voice. Something that was almost like wind moving through a vast space, except the well was small, had never been deep, and wind doesn't have intention behind it. Wind doesn't spell out words in the darkness where human voices go to end. I should have run. My body wanted to run. But my feet wouldn't move, because my feet didn't belong to me anymore, not entirely. They belonged to something that had carved its claim into the earth, that had marked me with condensation and mud and carved stone, something that was still waiting for me to understand what I'd promised it 15 years ago in this place, what I would have to give to remember. The figure at the tree line had multiplied, not stood exactly, appeared multiple shapes in the same not quite right proportions, all of them looking in my direction, all of them waiting with the patience of things that don't experience time the way the living do. And I understood in that moment of approaching darkness that the word carved into the stone had never been a command. It had been a reminder, a prophecy written backward from a future I couldn't see. Stay, it said, and the meaning was finally clear. Not a suggestion, not a demand. A statement of what had already happened, what was happening, what would continue to happen in a place I had marked as mine, in a well that had learned to speak in the language of commitment and debt. I stood there as the dark came down, as the not quite right shapes drew closer, as the world settled into a shape I no longer recognized. And in that darkness, I finally remembered what I had carved into the stone all those years ago. I remembered the word. I remembered the choice. I remembered the reason. But by then, it was far too late to take it back. The well had already learned my name, and it would never forget. Part 4. Aftermath, I don't remember leaving the well. That's not dramatic or mysterious. It's simply true. The mechanics of how I crossed that threshold between the forest and the place where normal logic still held weight are absent from my memory in the way childhood amnesia works. There's a gap. Not frightening exactly, just empty. What I remember is being on the highway, 3 miles out. A semi passing me, its lights washing everything colorless for a moment. And then I was walking on gravel with my shoes wet and something dark under my fingernails that took weeks to fully disappear. My phone had no battery. The time on the lock screen before it died had read 3:47 a.m. I'd left my apartment at 2:15 p.m. The math didn't reconcile, but I stopped trying to make it do so. Some things are easier to move past when you don't look too directly at them. A state trooper found me 6 miles further along. I told him my car had broken down, that I'd been walking for what felt like hours. He accepted this without much interrogation, which in retrospect suggests I must have looked exactly as bad as I felt. There was a uniform to the narrative, a sensible progression. He drove me to a service station. I called a tow truck company. Everything proceeded according to the social contract. By morning, I was back in my apartment. By afternoon, I was showering. By evening, I was pretending that the preceding 48 hours had happened to someone else, someone I'd heard about secondhand, whose story I'd absorbed but not quite believed. This worked for approximately 4 days. Then I began to notice the small things. The way my bathroom mirror seemed to hold water longer than it should. A faint residue that I could see in certain light, just at the edges of reflection. The way my sleep had developed a strange texture. Not insomnia exactly. It was more that I would wake at precisely 3:47 a.m., my heart moving with the rhythmic steadiness of something patient, and I wouldn't be able to return to whatever place my body had been exploring behind my eyelids. My dreams, when they came, were of descending, not falling. Descending, there's a difference. Falling is involuntary. It has panic in it. Descending is purposeful, a steady movement downward into spaces that got progressively darker and narrower and more aware. In these dreams, I could feel stone beneath my fingertips, worn smooth by something other than time. And I could feel that I was moving toward something that had been waiting for me with the kind of patience that doesn't know how to do anything else. I mentioned none of this to anyone. Work continued. My supervisor noticed I was quieter than usual and made a comment about it that I deflected with the ease of someone who'd practiced small deceptions their entire life. Friends invited me out. I went, performed adequacy, left early citing fatigue. The routines of my life assembled themselves around the hollow space I'd become, and most of the time, if I didn't look directly at that hollow, everything appeared relatively normal. But there were cracks. The mud never completely left my shoes. I mean this literally. I bought new shoes. The ones from the well, I threw away. But in the new ones, after I'd walked a certain distance, there would be a faint smell, wet earth, stone that had never seen sunlight, and something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and old. I threw those away too. The next pair, the same thing happened. I stopped trying. The substance under my fingernails became a periodic problem. It wasn't dirt. It was thicker than dirt, denser, and when I managed to get most of it out, there was always a residue, a faint darkening around the cuticles that no amount of scrubbing would remove. After a while, I accepted it the way you accept a scar. It became part of the landscape of my hands. 3 weeks after the well, I drove past the access road. I wasn't meaning to. I was taking a different route to work, and the road just appeared, and my hands were already turning the wheel. The car seemed to know where to go. I didn't fight it. The gate was still there. The sign was still there. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, which should have been reassuring, but somehow wasn't. What unnerved me was how familiar it had become. Not just the place itself, but my relationship to it. The way my body relaxed as I approached. The way my breathing became easier. The way something in my chest that had been taut for weeks loosened like a hand unclenching. I didn't drive all the way back to the well. I only went as far as the clearing, the place where the trees began to thin. But I sat in the car for an hour, and in that hour I felt the weight of that place like a hand on my shoulder. Not hostile, not demanding, just present. Waiting, there was no fog this time. The light was clear. I could see into the forest with reasonable clarity, and I could see that nothing was moving in the way things normally move. Everything was still. The kind of still that isn't empty, it's full of suspension. Held breath. When I left, I felt something depart with me. Not completely. Not in any way I could prove. But I felt it, like the gentle tug of a rope attached to something deep, the kind of thing you only notice when the tension goes slack. I haven't gone back since. But I think about it. Constantly, not obsessively. It's not that. It's more the W-stag additional middle section the well itself seemed to absorb light. Even when I aimed my flashlight directly into its throat, the beam became diffuse, softened as if the darkness inside had weight, density. I could make out the curved brick walls descending perhaps 20 feet before the light simply dissolved. The mortar between the bricks had calcified pale, almost white in places, creating a landscape of horizontal lines that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I sat on the ground perhaps 6 feet away from it, my back against the foundation of what had once been a farmhouse. The wall behind me was still warm from the day's heat, even though the sun had been gone for hours. Around me, the property breathed its slow evening exhalations. The wind moved through the tall grass surrounding the well in waves, creating a sound like someone running their hand across fabric, back and forth, back and forth. It was almost soothing until I realized how calculated it sounded, how deliberately paced. The smell down there was particular, not the usual scent of earth and mineral water. This was older, layered. There was rust, yes, the iron tang of oxidized metal from chains or pulleys long since surrendered to time. But underneath that was something else, something like old paper, like books left in a basement for decades, like the particular staleness of air that hasn't moved in longer than anyone should reasonably expect. I kept the flashlight pointed at the opening. My hands had stopped shaking, but my breathing hadn't normalized. There was a pressure in my chest that felt unrelated to fear, something more like recognition, the kind of feeling you get when you see a photograph of someone you've never met, but somehow remember. The carved letters seemed deeper now. I traced them again with my fingers, feeling where the brick had been scored, where someone, I, had pressed hard enough to leave a permanent mark. The grooves were smooth, worn at the edges by decades of weathering and rainfall and the slow, patient work of time. But they were also surprisingly deep. Whoever had made them hadn't been tentative. The incision spoke of purpose, of someone working methodically, pressing the tool, knife, stone, something sharp, with steady pressure and complete certainty. Looking at my name carved there, I found myself wondering about the order. which letter had come first. Had it been done in one sitting or several? Were there pauses between strokes, moments of doubt? The carved letters gave no indication of hesitation. They were uniform in depth, the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The property around the well seemed to have its own topology. The grass didn't grow evenly. There were areas where it was thick and wild, reaching up past my knees, and other areas where the ground appeared almost deliberately bare, worn down to pale soil. A path, I realized. There were paths worn around the well, not recent ones. These were old pathways, marked into the earth by repeated footsteps over years, maybe decades. They radiated outward from the well like spokes on a wheel that had been turned backward in time. I stood and followed one of the paths. My flashlight created a tunnel of visibility. Everything beyond the beam's reach sliding away into genuine darkness. The path led to what had been a cottage or a storage structure. The foundation was still visible, the concrete cracked and heaving where tree roots had pushed from below. But what caught my attention was the pattern of the cracks. They seemed almost deliberate, almost like writing. I didn't want to look too closely. The air temperature had dropped noticeably. I could see it in the way the darkness now seemed to hang in the spaces between objects, thick and visible like smoke. My breath had become visible too, small clouds that appeared with each exhalation and then dissolved upward. The wind that had been moving through the grass had stopped. The silence was complete except for my own breathing and the sound of my footsteps crushing dried leaves and brittle grass. Back toward the well, the opening looked even darker now. My flashlight battery was beginning to fade slightly. I could tell by the subtly dimmer edge of the beam. I hadn't thought about what I'd do if the light failed entirely. The thought arrived fully formed. I would have to walk out of here in complete darkness, following paths I couldn't see, guided by nothing but the memory of where the property boundary was. The cottage foundation had a smell too, a separate smell from the rest of the property. Newer decay. This structure had only recently stopped being a place where human intention lived. I could sense that distinction in the way the air felt here. The well, by contrast, felt genuinely ancient. The well felt like it had been pulling things down into itself for longer than I'd been alive. I stood in the center of what had been the cottage and turned slowly, letting my flashlight travel across the landscape. The well was visible from here, or at least its opening was. It looked like a dark mouth in the landscape, swallowing the small amount of light I could spare for it. From this distance, I couldn't see my name carved in it anymore. It was just an absence, a void, a place where the world seemed to have developed a cavity. The paths around the property created patterns I hadn't noticed before. Some led to the cottage, others led to the perimeter. But more than that, I realized they didn't all lead away from the well. Some of them spiraled around it. Circling, the worn spots in the grass and earth showed where something had walked in loops, in rings, in patterns that suggested intention more than mere passage. I realized I was breathing too fast again. The pressure in my chest had returned, and now it felt more specific. It felt like recognition. It felt like remembering something that had happened to someone else but was happening to me. Behind me, some distance away, I heard the sound of something moving through the grass. Not wind, something deliberate, something with weight. I didn't turn around immediately. I stood perfectly still, my flashlight still pointed at the well. and waited for the sound to come again. It did. Closer, the rustling of the tall grass as something large moved through it. But when I finally turned to look, my flashlight found nothing but the empty paths and the wild grass moving in a wind I could no longer feel. Hey, you think about something familiar, something you know you'll eventually have to confront again. Something that's waiting for you with the patience of stone and centuries and slow accumulation. My sleep has improved somewhat. The nightly awakening at 3:47 a.m. has become less frequent, maybe 2 or 3 times a week instead of every night. But when it does happen, I lie in the dark and feel the pull of that place, gentle and insistent, like a current in deep water. And I understand that it's not going away. More interesting is what started happening at the edges of my normal life. Small disruptions. My apartment has a well, of sorts, a utility shaft that goes down into the basement. I've stopped looking at it directly. In my mother's basement where I grew up, there was a similar structure. I remember now that I was always afraid of it as a child, but I don't remember why. More recently, I've become aware of something in the building next to my apartment, something old and stone, something that goes down farther than the architecture should allow. I can hear water moving in it on certain nights when the building is quiet. The word on the stone at the well, the one I carved there, has begun to appear in other places. Not literally, not carved by human hands, but visible in the pattern of condensation on my windows, in the arrangement of dirt on my car after rain, in the configuration of leaves I found arranged on my doorstep last week in a formation that couldn't have been accidental. Once I saw it written in the foam of my coffee. I know what this means. I know what it's building toward. And I suspect I've always known, the way you know certain things without anyone ever having to explain them. The knowledge that lives in the oldest part of your brain, the part that remembers everything before language. The well is still waiting. It's patient. It has learned my name, and it has learned something else, where I sleep, where I work, where I go when I'm trying to convince myself that normal life is still possible. It's learned the particular frequency of my heartbeat, the taste of my choices, the weight of my particular loneliness. And every night at 3:47 a.m. it calls. Not urgently, just to remind me that I made a promise there 15 years ago in a moment I couldn't quite remember, and that promises made in stone don't dissolve just because you leave. They don't fade. They don't forgive. They just wait, the way certain places wait, the way stone waits, the way the earth waits, patient, ancient, and absolutely certain that eventually everything that leaves will have to come back. Last night, I noticed something new. When I look at my hands, really look at them, at the map of veins beneath the skin, at the places where the dark residue still clings, I can almost see the pattern. It's not quite a word yet, but it's becoming one. Slowly, inevitably, like something writing itself into existence. Like a name I almost recognize. Story 3. The subdivision where all the houses face inward. The gravel crunched differently here, sharper somehow, the sound carrying too far in the still air. I noticed it the moment I turned off the state road and onto the entrance drive, my truck's tires grinding over stones that hadn't been properly maintained in years. The sound made me think of breaking glass, though nothing was broken. Not yet. Crescentwood Heights. That's what the faded sign said, mounted on a wooden frame at the subdivision's mouth. The letters had been green once, I think. Now, they were the color of old teeth. I'd been hired by the county to do a preliminary assessment, structural integrity, environmental hazards, salvage potential. Boilerplate work. A 1970s development on the eastern edge of town, they'd told me. 40 houses arranged in some kind of circular pattern, abandoned for reasons unclear, though the paperwork suggested financial failure, a developer who'd run out of money before the infrastructure was complete. These things happened. I'd surveyed enough dead neighborhoods to know the rhythm, optimism, then silence, then decay. But as I drove deeper in past the entrance, something about the silence felt deliberate. The houses emerged from the tree line in stages. First, just the roof lines, peaked and utilitarian against the gray morning sky. Then the walls came into view, brick and siding, colors muted by time and neglect. Browns, creams, a faded avocado that must have seemed modern in 1975. The trees had crept inward around them like a slow exhalation, oaks and maples reclaiming the boundaries of what had been yards. Grass grew in the cracks of driveways. A child's bicycle lay in the lawn of the first house, its handlebars twisted at an angle that looked like a broken neck. I pulled my truck to the curb and stepped out. The air smelled like wet mulch and the particular cold that comes from shade. The houses formed a circle around me, their windows dark. No sound, no birds. I've worked in plenty of empty places, foreclosed homes, shuttered malls, the gutted cores of dead shopping centers, but those places usually carry the noise of abandonment, wind through broken windows, the settling of old materials, the small animal sounds of creatures who've moved in to fill the vacuum humans left behind. This was different. This was quiet in a way that felt like listening. I consulted my paperwork, checking the address against the map I'd been given. The plot was roughly circular, with 40 residential lots arranged in concentric rings around a central green space. Each lot was roughly a quarter acre, homes positioned to maximize visibility toward the center. At least, that's what the subdivision plat suggested. Looking at the actual layout as it stood, I realized this design choice meant something I hadn't fully considered until now. Every front of every house faced inward. Not a single house faced the outer road. I stood in the street for a moment, letting this detail settle. The driveways curved inward, leading to garages positioned toward the subdivision's heart. The front porches, what remained of them, some had collapsed into their foundations, all looked toward the circle. Even the mailboxes, still mounted on some of the older posts, were oriented the same way. A rational explanation presented itself immediately: community planning. Crescentwood Heights had been designed as an insular neighborhood, its appeal centered on the shared green space. This was common in the 1970s, before suburban sprawl demanded cul-de-sacs and privacy fences. A developer's vision of community, a place where neighbors would see each other, where the architecture itself encouraged gathering. So why did it feel wrong? I made my way toward the nearest house, walking up a driveway that had buckled in places where tree roots had heaved the asphalt from below. My footsteps were loud. Everything was loud out here. A crow called from somewhere deep in the surrounding forest, and the sound made me pause. My hand reaching instinctively for my phone, not that service would help me out here. No towers in this direction. No signal beyond a few bars that came and went like a heartbeat. The house itself was a ranch-style structure, probably 1,800 square feet. Brick on the foundation, vinyl siding above, stained a dark brown by weather and age. The front door was closed but not locked. I tried it without thinking, my contractor's habit overriding any instinct toward caution. The mechanism was stiff but gave way, and the door swung inward on hinges that protested with a drawn-out creak. Inside, the air was different, cooler, and there was a smell, not decay, not rot, nothing dramatic, but something musty and static. The smell of a place that hadn't breathed in a long time. The smell of closed doors and drawn curtains, even though the curtains I could see from the entrance were long gone, the rods bare. I stepped inside and let my eyes adjust. The front room opened immediately to my left, oriented toward what would be the center of the subdivision. Large windows, probably the modern span of glass that had sold these homes to young families in the mid-'70s, looked out toward the overgrown green space I couldn't quite see from the entry. The furniture was gone, but the carpet remained, worn to a nearly uniform gray in the center of the room, darker around the perimeter where it had been protected from foot traffic, or where it had been deliberately left unworn. What struck me was the arrangement of the space. The worn carpet formed a rough circle, and I could see faint impressions in the pile where furniture had stood. Couches, maybe chairs, all of them positioned to face those central windows, arranged in what I could only describe as concentric rings. It was deliberate. Someone had placed them that way. Someone had lived their life sitting in those chairs, looking out at whatever was happening in that central green. I moved to the window and looked out. The green space was larger than I'd expected, roughly 2 acres of what had once been landscaped lawn. It was overgrown now, the grass tall and wild, interspersed with saplings and undergrowth. There were weeds the size of shrubs pushing up through broken concrete in the center. A foundation, I realized, rectangular and deliberate. Something had been planned for that spot, something that had never been built. Behind me, the house creaked. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. Just the settling of old wood, the contraction of materials as temperature and humidity shifted. The sound had come from somewhere deeper in the structure, the kitchen maybe, or one of the bedrooms. I told myself it was natural. I told myself that empty houses make sounds. But I stayed alert anyway. Habit. The walls in this front room bore witness to something. I moved closer, noticing faint marks on the paint, pencil lines, mostly erased, but still faintly visible in the right light. A series of horizontal marks at roughly the same height, running in sections along the wall. They looked almost like measurements, or teles. I reached out and touched one, and the mark came away slightly on my finger. Graphite dust. The pencil marks probably decades old. I pulled out my phone and took several pictures, even though the images wouldn't capture what my eyes could see. The deliberate nature of the marks, the way they seemed to track something, measure something, the sheer number of them. Moving deeper into the house, I found more of the same. Kitchen walls bearing similar pencil marks. A hallway where the marks formed a grid pattern, as if someone had been tracking time or counting something with methodical precision. And in each room I entered, the windows all faced inward, toward that overgrown center, toward that incomplete foundation, toward whatever it was the residents of this house had believed they needed to watch. I found a bedroom where the closet was empty, not just devoid of clothes, but cleaned, wiped down. The metal rod that had held hangers was still there, but nothing else. In another bedroom, the walls were bare except for faint ghosting where pictures had been hung, rectangular pale patches against the slightly darker surrounding paint. Someone had removed them, recently enough that the paint hadn't faded in the uncovered squares, but long enough ago that the marks were subtle. In the master bedroom, I found something that made me stop. A bed frame remained, the mattress long gone or decayed beyond recognition, but arranged on the bedside table were empty picture frames, not knocked over or scattered. Arranged, there were 4 of them, standing in a neat line, facing outward toward an observer, all empty, all deliberately positioned to display nothing. I stood in that room for a long moment, my contractor's mind trying to parse what I was seeing, trying to convert it into the language of structural assessment and salvage potential. But my older instincts, the ones that had developed over decades of working in empty places, those instincts were telling me something different. They were telling me that this house wasn't abandoned. It was surrendered. The difference, I would learn, was important. I left that house through the front door, stepping back out into the afternoon light, which hadn't changed but felt different now. The same gray sky, the same weight of the trees pressing in from the borders of the subdivision. But I was aware, suddenly, of how the houses formed a barrier around me, how they all faced inward, creating a wall of attention directed toward the center. How I was, for the moment, at the focus of all those empty windows. I walked toward the next house, telling myself it was research, telling myself that understanding the pattern would help with the assessment. But I was also telling myself that I needed to understand what had happened here before I left. The gravel crunched beneath my boots. Somewhere in the overgrown green, something moved, probably a deer, probably nothing, and the brush disturbed in that movement rustled loud enough that I stopped walking and listened. The sound didn't repeat. I continued on, toward the house that faced me from across the circle. Its door was closed, its windows were dark, and every opening of that house looked directly at me, and at all the others like me who might wander into this place seeking answers. The subdivision surrounded me on all sides now. 40 houses, arranged in rings, all facing in, all watching. And whatever I was supposed to find in this place, I was beginning to understand that it wasn't meant to be discovered by someone walking through in daylight checking boxes on an assessment form. It was meant to be realized slowly. It was meant to accumulate. I reached the next house and tried the door. It opened more easily than the last one. Part 2. Rising tension. The interior of this house was different from the first. Where that one had been sealed in its abandonment, dusty, untouched, preserved in time, this one showed signs of recent occupation. Not recent in the sense of days or weeks, months perhaps, the kind of recent that meant someone had been here, and then had simply stopped. The kitchen sink held a single glass, no others in the cabinet, 1 plate, 1 bowl, 1 fork. It was the inventory of a solitary person, and it was arranged with the precision of someone who knew exactly how many of each thing they needed. I opened the refrigerator. Empty, clean inside, actually, cleaner than it should have been, as if it had been methodically emptied and wiped down. I went back to the living room. The blinds were all drawn but not closed completely. They were bent at specific angles, allowing thin slats of afternoon light to fall across the floor in parallel lines. I stood in those lines and looked at the furniture. A sofa facing the window, a television across from it, the screen dark and still, a bookshelf almost empty, and on one wall, above a side table, a calendar hung up, ready to be marked. The calendar was from 6 years ago. I crossed to it without knowing why I needed to look at it so urgently. My hand was already reaching before my mind had caught up with the impulse. The dates were marked, not every date, just certain days scattered throughout the months. No pattern I could discern. March 14th had a small mark, July 7th. November 3rd. Different months, different seasons. The marks were made in pencil, neat and deliberate. I wondered what those dates meant, what they had counted toward. When I turned away from the calendar, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were walls between rooms that shouldn't have been walls. The open floor plan of the house had been subdivided. Walls had been added, creating smaller rooms from larger ones. I could see where they had been installed. New drywall, the seams barely visible but unmistakable once you saw them. Someone had spent time here. Someone had changed this house deliberately, methodically, making it smaller on the inside. That was when I heard the sound from upstairs. It was faint, a shifting, like weight being distributed across a floorboard. A creak that was too deliberate to be the settling of an old house, followed by silence. Then, after a pause, another creak in a different location, as if something were walking slowly from one end of the second floor to the other. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My assessment notebooks were still under my arm, my pen still clipped to my pocket. The practical part of my mind, the part that had walked through dozens of empty houses, that understood structural integrity and building code violations, that part tried to catalog the sound. Settling foundation, compromised framing, animals in the attic, moving in the walls. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was different from the silence I had walked into minutes before. This silence had the quality of attention, of something above me, paused in its movement, aware that it had made itself known. I left that house through the same door I had entered, and I did not close it behind me. The sun was lower now than it should have been. I checked my watch, but the motion felt like it happened to someone else. The afternoon had passed differently inside that house. Time had moved at a different speed, or I had moved through it at a different rate, and now the light had taken on a quality of lateness that made my stomach tight. The gravel seemed louder under my boots as I walked away. Each step was distinct, separate, impossible to muffle. And as I walked, I became aware of something that might have always been present, but which I was only now noticing. The neighborhood was too quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of an empty place, not the natural quiet of a subdivision on an afternoon when most of its residents were at work or school or somewhere else. This was a different kind of quiet, an enforced quiet, a quiet that felt like it was being maintained. No birds sang in the trees. No distant traffic drifted from the roads beyond the development. No wind moved through the overgrown landscaping. The air itself seemed still, waiting. I made a decision, or thought I made one. I still can't be entirely certain about the element of choice in what followed. I decided to visit one more house before I left, just one, to verify. To confirm that what I had seen in the second house was unique, or was part of a pattern. The third house was on the opposite side of the circle. I could see it clearly from where I stood. Its front door was white, or had been white at some point. Now it had faded to the color of old bone. The mailbox on the post had a name on it, Morgan. I don't know why that name stopped me. There's nothing inherently strange about a name on a mailbox. These had been residential homes. Of course, they had names attached to them, identities, families who had chosen them. But seeing it now, seeing that name in particular, Morgan, made something in my chest contract, made me aware of how quiet my breathing had become. I wrote the name down in my notebook. I don't know why I did that either. As I approached the house, I noticed something about all the houses I could see from this vantage point. Their windows were dark, yes, but now that I was looking more carefully, I could see that they weren't dark in the way windows become dark when they're simply unlit. They were dark because something was blocking the light from inside. Blackout curtains, perhaps, or something drawn across the glass. In some windows, I could see what might have been tape, white lines that formed rectangles or crosses. The front door to Morgan's house was unlocked, like the second one. I pushed it open slowly. The interior was dark enough that it took a moment for my eyes to adjust. The windows were indeed covered. Heavy black fabric hung over every opening, held in place with nails. Not professional installation, home installation, done from the inside where the light was. The living room opened directly onto the kitchen, and in that kitchen I saw something that made me stop. There were notebooks, stacks of them, real notebooks like the one I was carrying, but worn soft from use. They were arranged in chronological order along the kitchen counter, dozens of them, spanning what looked like years of time. I picked one up at random. The cover was warped from handling, the pages dog-eared. I opened it to a random page and found a date. Then words, then another date, then more words. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical. The same hand that had marked those dates on the calendar in the previous house. The same careful, methodical person who had subdivided the rooms and reduced the house down to its smallest functional size. I opened to another page, another date, another entry. The dates were consecutive, not every date, but most of them, weeks recorded in sequence. Months, I flipped through the notebook and found the final page filled, and then the next notebook began, and it continued the sequence. I opened the third notebook in the stack, pressing it open to the middle. The entries continued, the same handwriting, the same careful recording of days. But there were notes now, not just dates, but words, short phrases. Observations, one-page read, they still face the same way. All of them, all facing in. Another, the pattern hasn't changed. The coordination hasn't broken. How long has this been happening? And another, dated 3 years prior, I think they're waiting for something. Or for someone. I think they've always been waiting. I put the notebook down. My hand was shaking, which seemed disproportionate to what I had found. It was unsettling, certainly. A person living here, recording observations about the neighborhood, making notes about the houses and their orientation. It was eccentric, but it wasn't impossible. People became isolated in empty places. They developed obsessions. They created structures of meaning to fill the void. But I knew what had unnerved me. It was the fact that the handwriting matched what I now recognized as the same person's marks throughout this house. The person who had covered the windows, who had subdivided the rooms, who had recorded the dates and the observations obsessively, day after day, year after year. The person who lived here had been watching the neighborhood just as carefully as the neighborhood seemed to be watching. And then, from somewhere deeper in the house, I heard a sound. It was a door closing, a soft, deliberate closing, as if someone were being careful not to make too much noise, as if they didn't want to startle me, as if instead they were hoping I would have time to hear it and realize I was not alone. I walked out of that house without examining anything else. The dusk was moving in now, not gradually, but with the sudden acceleration of late afternoon in places where the trees are tall enough to accelerate the darkness. The sun had not actually set, but the shadows had grown so long that they connected, merging into a continuous twilight across the entire subdivision. As I made my way back toward the entrance, toward where I had parked my truck, which now seemed impossibly far away, I realized that I was no longer sure of the correct path. The houses all looked the same. The circles looked the same. The pattern that had seemed so logical and geometric when I had first arrived had become a labyrinth, and I was moving through it in the wrong direction or the right direction, but without any way to verify which. That was when I saw the light. It came from one of the houses to my left, a thin golden light escaping from between the edges of a covered window. Someone had turned on a lamp inside. Someone was inside one of these houses, and they had just, in that moment, decided to break the darkness and announce their presence to me. The light went out almost immediately. 3 seconds perhaps, just enough time to be noticed. Then darkness again. And the silence that followed the light, which was somehow heavier than the silence that had preceded it. Because now the silence contained knowledge. Now it contained the understanding that this subdivision was not empty. It had only appeared to be empty. And if the houses were occupied, if someone was living in each of these structures, covering the windows, recording observations, dividing the spaces into smaller and smaller rooms, then the most likely explanation for why they had all abandoned their normal lives and come here was not something I wanted to fully consider. I finally found my truck just as the last light drained from the sky. I drove out of that subdivision, and I did not slow down or look back until I had merged onto the highway and could no longer see the trees that marked its borders in my rearview mirror. But I sat in my hotel that night, with my assessment forms still unsigned and my notebooks still open, staring at nothing, understanding that I would have to go back, that the assessment was incomplete, that there were answers in that place, and they required that I stay longer than an afternoon. That night, I did not sleep, and in the small hours of the morning, I made a decision that I can only now understand as something other than my own choice, though it felt like one at the time. I decided to return. Part 3. Escalation. The second visit began before dawn, while the sky was still the color of old bruises. I had convinced myself that returning in darkness was the right choice, that I would see things more clearly, that the light phenomena I had witnessed would be more obvious, that I could finally understand the pattern. Looking back, I recognized this reasoning as the first clear sign that my judgment had already been compromised. But at the time, it felt like logic. It felt like necessary caution. I parked my truck at the entrance to the subdivision and sat for nearly an hour before I moved. The gate was open. It had been open the day before, and it remained open now as if it had never been closed at all. as if the subdivision existed in a permanent state of welcome and imprisonment simultaneously. The streetlights that ran along the entrance boulevard had all burned out, or had never worked at all. I had not noticed this yesterday in the dying light. Now it seemed like the most obvious fact about this place, as if darkness were its natural state and the afternoon sun had been the anomaly. I had brought a flashlight this time and a camera. I had also brought my assessment forms, though I no longer understood what assessment I was making, or why any form could possibly capture what I was beginning to intuitively sense about this place. The houses seemed to recognize me. This is not metaphorical. As I walked deeper into the subdivision, past the same geometric cul-de-sacs, under the same symmetrical trees, I felt the quality of the darkness change around each structure, as if they were aware of my presence and were adjusting themselves accordingly. The windows seemed darker than they should have been. The doors seemed more firmly closed. There was an order to the silence, a kind of organized restraint. I made my way deliberately toward the house where I had heard the door closing the day before. It was on the eastern edge of the subdivision, at the terminus of a circle street called Clearview Lane, which was perhaps the most absurd name for any street I had ever encountered. There was nothing clear here. There was no view. There was only the accumulation of visual weight, of structure upon structure, arranged in perfect repetition until repetition itself became a kind of message. The door was different this time. Yesterday it had been a standard color, a beige or tan that blended with the house's exterior trim. Now, as I illuminated it with my flashlight, I could see that it had been painted. The paint was fresh enough that I could smell it, a sharp, chemical smell that seemed to cut through the cold night air. The paint was dark red, almost burgundy, and it covered only the door itself, not the frame. It was as if someone had taken careful pains to mark this entrance, to make it distinct, to draw attention to it specifically. I did not go through that door. Instead, I moved around the back of the house, my flashlight beam catching on the overgrown yard, on flower beds that had never been planted, on grass that had grown into the height of wild vegetation. The back door was in view now, and I could see that it too had been painted. The same deep red, the same careful application. Someone had spent time on this work. Someone had made a deliberate statement with these doors, and that someone was still here, or had been here very recently. That was when I heard the sound from inside. It was not a door closing this time. It was something else, a movement, the shifting of weight, the sound of something being dragged across a floor. It came from the interior of the house, from somewhere in the middle depth of the structure, not near the door, deep inside, as if whatever was making the sound had heard me approaching the back entrance and had deliberately moved away from me. Deeper into the house, further from the light of my flashlight, I left the property and returned to the cul-de-sac. My hands were shaking. I was moving too quickly now, no longer thinking in the measured, analytical way I had intended. The rational part of my mind was insisting that there were explanations for all of this. Someone lived here. Someone had painted their doors. Someone had moved inside their home. These were normal things, ordinary things, the kinds of things that happened in occupied houses every single day. But no one lived in this subdivision. I was certain of it. The knowledge of this certainty came from somewhere I could not identify. It came from the accumulation of observations, the absence of cars, the covered windows, the geometric perfection of the layout. But more than that, it came from something else, something I had been trying not to fully acknowledge. It came from the way the presence in these houses felt. Not like occupation, not like habitation, but like watching, like waiting, like the arrangement of a space in order to contain something or someone in a very specific configuration. I stood in the center of Clearview Lane and shone my flashlight at the houses surrounding me. All of them were dark. All of them were silent. All of them felt, in that moment, like they were facing inward, not in the architectural sense, but in a deeper sense, as if they were turning their attention toward the center of the subdivision, toward the cul-de-sacs and the circles, toward the spaces where people moved between them, as if the houses themselves were watching the streets, and whatever was inside them was watching me. I found myself walking toward the center of the subdivision, toward what I had noticed on the first visit, but had not fully processed, a small plaza or gathering space where several of the residential streets converged. It was empty now, as it had been yesterday. But in the center of the plaza there was a structure I had barely noted before. It was small, no more than 10 feet across, and it had the appearance of a pavilion or a gazebo, though it had never been finished. The framework was there, metal poles, a skeletal roof structure, but it had never been completed. It stood like a monument to incompleteness, or perhaps like a space that was waiting to be finished, still waiting, even though the subdivision around it seemed decades old. I walked to the center of this structure and stood there, turning slowly to take in the view. The houses surrounded the plaza in their perfect geometric arrangement. They faced inward, every single one of them. Their front doors all opened toward the center. All of them opened toward the space where I was standing. And as I stood there, I became aware of something that I had been sensing throughout the night, but had been unable to fully formulate. I was not alone in the subdivision. I had not been alone since I arrived. The presence I had felt the day before had been there when I pulled up to the entrance, and it was there now, distributed somehow across the entire space, as if it were not one thing but many things working in concert, as if the houses themselves were some kind of distributed organism, or as if the organism was the houses, or as if the distinction between the two had long ago ceased to matter. I took a photograph of the unfinished pavilion. When I looked at the image on the screen of my camera, I could see something at the edges of the frame. It was indistinct, obscured by the low resolution and the darkness, but it was there, a shape, in one of the windows of the houses that faced the plaza. Just barely visible, just enough to be noticed. I took another photograph, this one aimed directly at the house where I thought I had seen the shape. The image showed the same window, the same faint darkness within the darkness. But when I zoomed in, enlarging the image on the small camera screen, I could see that the shape had changed. It was no longer at the window. It was further inside, deeper in the house, moving away from the light. I left the plaza and made my way back toward the entrance to the subdivision. I was moving quickly now, but I was no longer panicked. I was moving with purpose. I understood, in a way that I had been resisting until that moment, that I needed to leave, that the assessment was not going to be completed, that whatever was happening in this place was not something that could be documented or understood through conventional means, that staying any longer was not going to provide me with answers. It was only going to provide the thing that was watching me with more time to understand what I was. But as I reached the entrance to the subdivision, I found that my truck was no longer where I had parked it. The space was empty. The concrete where I had left my vehicle was bare, unmarked, as if nothing had ever been parked there at all. I stood in the darkness at the entrance to the subdivision, understanding with a clarity that felt almost like calm that I had made a significant error in judgment, that I had been herded here, that the open gate was not an invitation but a trap, and that the trap had closed the moment I had decided to return. I turned to walk back into the subdivision toward the center because it seemed like the only logical direction to go. The houses watched from their cul-de-sacs, their windows dark, their doors facing inward. And as I walked, I heard the sound again, not from one house, but from all of them, a low, deliberate sound, like the collective act of many doors being closed at precisely the same moment. It took me until dawn to find another way out. I do not remember the path I took, or the specific sequence of streets I walked. I only remember that at some point the geometry of the subdivision began to unravel. The circles became less perfect. The houses became less uniform. And eventually I emerged into the forest that surrounded the entire development. My truck was waiting on the access road outside the subdivision. It was parked exactly where I had left it. The engine started immediately. And as I drove away, looking in the rearview mirror at the entrance to the subdivision fading behind me, I could see the gates beginning to close, slowly, deliberately, as if someone had finally decided that I had seen enough. I never filed the assessment. My company sent me a letter 2 weeks later asking about my status. I did not respond. I have not driven past that subdivision since, and I have not permitted myself to drive along any road that would allow me even a glimpse of its boundaries. But last week I received something in the mail. It was a photograph. I do not know who sent it, and the envelope bore no return address. The photograph was from inside one of the houses in that subdivision. It was taken from inside a room looking toward a wall, and on that wall there was a portrait, a drawing or a sketch, rendered in what looked like pencil or charcoal. It was a drawing of me, and it was dated 3 weeks before I made my first visit to the subdivision. I have not shown this photograph to anyone. I do not know what it means or what I am supposed to do with it. But I know that the thing that lives in those houses, the presence that I felt watching me from within that perfect geometric arrangement of structures, I know that it is still watching. I know this because sometimes, in the middle of the night, I hear the sound of doors closing, all of them at once, as if they are closing in unison, as if they are closing in rhythm with something, or marking time until something arrives. And I am waiting with a dread that I can no longer distinguish from patience to understand what happens when all the doors have finished closing. Hashtag, the subdivision where all the houses face inward. Part 4, there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from living with something you cannot explain. It is not the exhaustion of work or sleeplessness, though I experience both in abundance now. It is the exhaustion of carrying a weight that no one else can see, that no one else believes exists. After the photograph arrived, I tried to return to something resembling a normal life. I went back to work. I drove to job sites. I assessed properties and filed reports. I spoke to colleagues about weather and traffic and the slow accumulation of minor frustrations that makes up most people's days. But I was doing all of this from behind glass. I was watching myself perform normalcy rather than actually living it. The house I live in is modest, a small ranch-style home on an ordinary street in an ordinary neighborhood. I chose it precisely because it is unremarkable. There is nothing about it that would draw attention or invite scrutiny. But after the photograph arrived, I became acutely aware of every room, every corner, every space where something could be watching and I would not know. I began locking doors that I had never locked before. Interior doors. The closet in my bedroom. The cabinet under the sink. I told myself this was practical, that I was just being cautious, but I knew the truth. I was trying to create barriers between myself and the idea that something was documenting my movements, preserving them in sketches and photographs, creating a record of me that existed before I had ever encountered the subdivision. 2 months after the photograph arrived, my company sent me to assess a strip of commercial property in a town I had never visited before. It was a routine job, 3 buildings, standard evaluation, a day's work at most. I drove there on a Tuesday morning, and I remember the relief I felt at the simple act of leaving, of putting distance between myself and the subdivision that had become as much a part of my geography as any physical location. The assessments were straightforward. The buildings were ordinary. I was pulling out of the parking lot, my mind already moving toward the 4-hour drive home, when I noticed something that made me stop the truck. Across the street from the commercial property, visible only because a gap in the buildings had created a clear sight line, there was a residential street. It was lined with houses, perhaps a dozen of them, arranged in a pattern that I recognized with a clarity that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. Not identical to the subdivision, but similar enough. Similar in the way they were set back from the road. Similar in the uniformity of their setback. Similar in the fact that their front doors faced inward, toward courts or private spaces, rather than toward the street where a person might naturally encounter them. I did not drive down that street. I forced myself to start the truck and drive away, following the GP's directions that led me out of the town as quickly as I could navigate. But I could not stop thinking about it. That night, I researched the town. I looked for planning records, property divisions, development companies. I found a reference to a subdivision project from the 1990s that had been partially completed before the developer ran into financial difficulties. The project had been abandoned for years, then revived by a different company. The houses had been built over the course of a decade, in phases spread across nearly 20 years. No single development, no cohesive plan. Just structures, placed according to some logic that I could not access or understand. I did not go back to that town. But I began noticing other things. A pattern of roads I had driven but never fully registered. A commercial area I had passed through without stopping. Suburbs on the outskirts of cities I visited for work. And in each of these places I would see it, sometimes just a glimpse, sometimes a full view, the same arrangement, the same orientation, houses facing inward, streets that seemed to follow a geometry that was almost but not quite standard, a perfection that was just slightly wrong, just slightly off in a way that only someone who had experienced the subdivision would recognize. The portfolio of properties I assess has shifted. without my conscious decision to shift it. I notice that I am being sent more and more to areas I have never visited before, small towns and exurban developments, places where I would have no reason to go except for work. And I have begun to ask myself whether this is coincidence or whether the work is being directed toward me specifically, toward someone who now understands what to look for. I've begun to ask myself whether my company has always been sending me to these places, and I simply did not have the knowledge to recognize them. 3 weeks ago, I drove past a mailbox in a neighborhood I was assessing. Nothing remarkable about the mailbox, standard design, mounted on a standard post, the kind you see in thousands of neighborhoods across the country. But my address was printed on it. My name was printed on it. It was my mailbox, but it was located in a suburb I had never lived in a house I had never visited, in a state I rarely traveled to. I told myself it was a prank, or an error, or some kind of misdirected mail. But I knew what it meant. I knew that there was a house with my address. I knew that there was a mailbox bearing my name. I knew that someone or something had created a place for me within the network of subdivisions, had been preparing a location the way you might prepare a room for a guest you were expecting. The sound of doors closing at night has become part of the rhythm of my sleep. I no longer jolt awake when I hear it. Instead, I lie in the darkness and listen, trying to count them, trying to determine whether there are more doors closing now than there were the night before. I have developed a theory about this, not a rational theory, but something I have pieced together from the accumulation of details and impossible observations. I think the doors are counting down. I think they are marking time until something is complete, until all the pieces have been put in place, until I have been cataloged and filed and preserved in every dimension of this impossible geography. I should have stopped accepting assignments to unfamiliar places. I should have found another profession, another way to exist in the world that did not involve being sent to places where the architecture was waiting for me. But I did not do these things. Instead, I continued to drive. I continued to assess. I continued to move from subdivision to subdivision, recognizing more and more of them, understanding with increasing clarity that they were all connected, all part of a larger geography that I had stumbled into when I had driven through those gates on a spring evening, looking for nothing more than an assessment form that I could complete and file and forget. Last week, I received another photograph in the mail. This one was different from the first. It was not a portrait. It was a photograph of a room, a bedroom, by the look of it, sparsely furnished, with a single bed and a window that looked out onto a cul-de-sac. And sitting on the bed, facing toward the window, was a figure. The photograph was clear enough that I could see details, the texture of clothing, the shape of a head, the curve of shoulders. But the face was turned away. The figure was looking out at the cul-de-sac beyond the window, watching the street, waiting for something. I have not been able to determine whether the room in the photograph is one I have already visited, or whether it is one I have not yet found. I have not been able to determine whether the figure sitting on the bed is meant to be me, or whether it is meant to be someone else. Someone like me, someone caught in the same geometry, someone else who has received a mailbox with their name on it in a town they did not recognize. This morning, I parked my truck on a quiet street in a development I was supposed to assess. The houses were arranged in perfect semicircles around a central court. The development was called Meridian Heights. I sat in the truck for a long time, looking at the houses, looking at the way the geometry arranged itself around that central space. And then I got out and began to walk. I did not walk toward the assessment site. I walked toward the center of the development, toward the court that formed the heart of the subdivision. And as I walked, I realized that the sound I heard, the sound I had been hearing for months now, the sound of doors closing in the night, was not coming from behind me. It was coming from ahead of me. It was coming from the houses, from within the geometric perfection of Meridian Heights, a sound that was patient and deliberate and certain of itself. I am still walking. Story 4. The utility tunnels beneath the town I grew up in. The gate was smaller than I remembered. That was my first thought standing in the overgrown lot behind the old maintenance building on Meridian Street. The chain link had gone rust orange, and someone had cut through it years ago, the edges curled back like peeled skin. I could see the original padlock still hanging there, decorative now, disconnected from anything functional. 15 years. That's how long it had been since I'd been back to this town. Long enough that the memories had become smooth and rounded, worn like river stones in my mind. I'd come back for reasons I wasn't entirely honest with myself about. Something about turning 30. About the persistent feeling that I'd left something unfinished here. Or maybe just left something, period. The maintenance access was exactly as I'd described it to myself 1,000 times. A concrete bunker, maybe 12 feet square, painted institutional gray. A single heavy door, still marked with faded yellow and black chevrons. The combination lock was gone, but the door swung open with surprising ease. Only a slight protest of hinges. I'd expected rust and resistance. Instead, it moved like someone had oiled it recently. Inside, the air hit different, cooler, with that particular smell of concrete and stagnant water and things that decay slowly in darkness. The stairs descended in a gentle curve, and I could see them clearly enough from the ambient light filtering down behind me. Concrete steps, worn smooth in the center by decades of feet. Or boots. The utility tunnels had been built in the 60s, part of some civil defense initiative that had never quite made sense to me as a kid. They connected the old municipal building to the water treatment plant, passing under 3 blocks of downtown. We used to sneak in here sometimes, though never far, never deep. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam was too bright, too clean against the industrial gray of the stairwell. It made everything look more abandoned, somehow rendered it in stark relief. The tunnel mouth opened at the bottom of the stairs, and I stepped through into it carefully. The floor was uneven, buckled in places where water damage had done its slow work. I could hear water now, the sound of it running somewhere distant. Pipes? Or something else flowing through the darkness. The tunnel was wide enough for 2 people side by side, maybe wider. Rusted pipes ran along both walls at chest height, and higher up conduit and old electrical boxes clustered against the concrete. The paint on the walls was faded, covered in a film of dust so thick it looked like velvet. The beam of my flashlight cut through it and illuminated maybe 30 feet before the tunnel curved away into black. I'd been inside these tunnels as a kid, once, twice, maybe. never enough to have a real sense of their scale. But walking into them as an adult, I was struck by how oppressive they felt. How final. The kind of place that absorbed sound, that made you aware of your own breathing. I started walking deeper, following the main tunnel. My footsteps echoed slightly, the sound flat and constrained. The air smelled like minerals and decay, like the inside of something ancient. Above me, the pipes ticked occasionally as water or pressure moved through them, or as things settled, as structures aged. The first thing I noticed was wrong about the place was subtle enough that I almost didn't register it consciously. It was just an absence, at first. The tunnel should have been covered in detritus, old papers, trash, things that accumulated in abandoned places. But the floor was oddly clear, dusty, yes, thick with dust, but swept in a way, or walked over repeatedly. The dust showed patterns, the ghost traces of footprints, and something else. Something that had left track marks in the powder. Tire tracks, a narrow wheelbase. A hand truck, maybe, or something similar. I stopped walking. The beam of my flashlight played across the floor ahead of me, and I could see it more clearly now that I was looking for it. The dust had been disturbed in parallel lines, maybe a foot apart. Something wheeled had passed through this tunnel. Recently, within weeks maybe, possibly more recent than that. The tunnel curved ahead, following the path of the street above. I could see light switches on the walls, ancient things, probably original to the 60s. They looked corroded, solid with rust. The electrical boxes had all been disconnected, the wires hung loose and harmless. I kept walking, my phone light steady ahead of me. The first sealed section appeared after maybe 100 feet. A wall of cinder blocks, maybe 8 feet high, sealed across the entire tunnel width. It looked new, the blocks were lighter colored than the surrounding concrete, and the mortar was still pale. Someone had built this barrier recently. Within the last few years, definitely. Maybe the last year. I approached it carefully. I'm not sure why. It was just a wall. But something about the deliberateness of it, the way it completely blocked the tunnel, made me hesitant. I ran my fingers along the mortar. It was hard, set solid, but I could smell something faint from between the blocks. Something that didn't smell like basement or mold, something almost mechanical. Oil, maybe, and underneath it, something else. Something organic and indefinable that made the back of my neck uncomfortable. I stepped back and played my light along the wall. It was solid work, no gaps, no visible weaknesses. Whoever had built this had intended it to stay, and they'd intended it to block something in, or block something out. Behind me I heard a sound. It was distant, echoing down the tunnel from the direction I'd come. Mechanical. A grinding sound, like metal on concrete, brief and then gone. I turned and pointed my light back the way I'd come, but the tunnel curved away and I couldn't see anything. The sound didn't repeat. I waited, listening. The silence that followed felt different than it had before. More aware, somehow more present. The tunnel I was in split about 50 feet further ahead, diverging into two smaller passages. Both were clear, both showed the same dusty floor with the same faint track marks. I took the left passage. My reasoning was arbitrary. Habit, maybe, or just the feeling that I'd come this far and I should at least see where one of these passages led. The second sealed wall appeared perhaps 200 feet into the left tunnel. This one was older than the first the blocks a different shade, the mortar darker and cracked in places. But it was equally solid, equally permanent. 2 walls, both recent additions to a tunnel system that had been sealed and abandoned for decades, as far as the town records claimed. 2 walls dividing the tunnel system into sections. 2 walls that implied someone was maintaining a presence in here, that someone, recently, had needed to keep certain parts of the tunnel sealed off from others, that someone was still here. The realization wasn't dramatic. It just sat there in my mind, a simple fact. Someone was using these tunnels. Someone had been in here recently enough that the dust still showed their passage, recently enough that the block's mortar was still fresh. And whoever it was, they'd gone to the trouble of isolating sections of the tunnel from others. I stood there in the darkness, my flashlight beam steady on the wall, and listened to the silence. It was a different silence now, not the silence of an empty place, but the silence of something being very carefully still. In the distance, deeper in the tunnel system, I heard water moving, or something like water, a distant rushing sound, far enough away that I couldn't locate it precisely. And underneath that, or possibly my imagination, the sense that something else was moving too. Something that had also heard me. Something that was also listening now, waiting to see what I would do next. I didn't move for a long time. My breath fogged the screen of my phone slightly, and I wiped it clear. The smell from between the cinder blocks was stronger here, or maybe I was just more aware of it now. Oil and metal and something that might have been food, or might have been something alive, breathing in the darkness somewhere deeper than I could reach. I began walking back toward the entrance. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. That was the first decision I made as I climbed back through the access point in the basement of the old municipal building. I sat there on the concrete floor for 20 minutes, trying to construct a narrative that made sense. Recent construction, fresh mortar, someone maintaining the tunnels. There were explanations, maintenance crews, water department. Maybe the town had decided to seal off unstable sections and no one had bothered to update the public records. Maybe that distant sound was just settling rock and the way sound travels through enclosed spaces, how it distorts and amplifies and plays tricks. But I knew better, and I knew I'd go back. For 3 days, I didn't. I told myself it was over, that I'd satisfied the curiosity that had been nagging at me for years. I went to work. I saw friends. I fell into the ordinary rhythm of a person living an ordinary life in the town where they grew up. But the tunnels were still there. The walls were still there. And someone was still down there, in the dark, doing something that required isolation and secrecy. On the evening of the 4th day, I started experiencing the dreams. They weren't nightmares exactly. Nothing happened in them. I would simply find myself walking the tunnels in darkness, my flashlight dead. Moving forward anyway because something behind me was also moving. I never saw what it was. I never heard it clearly. But I felt the certainty of its presence the way you feel temperature, as an objective fact rather than an emotion. When I woke, my chest would be tight, my palms damp. The dreams had a texture to them, a specificity that normal dreams lack. The concrete felt real under my palms. The smell was real. The cold was real. By the 7th day, I was back at the access point. I told myself I was being rational. There were questions that needed answers. How long had someone been using the tunnels? What were they doing down there? Was there danger, actual danger, or was I constructing threat from the simple fact of unknown activity? This last question seemed important. This was the question that justified going back. But I think the truth was simpler. I needed to know. The basement of the municipal building was exactly as I'd left it. The boxes were still stacked in the same disorder. The smell of old paper was still thick. My phone had better battery this time. I'd bought a proper flashlight, a heavy mag light that felt solid in my hand. Authoritative. As if authority mattered in a place like this. The first tunnel was unchanged. My footprints from a week ago were still visible in the dust, already beginning to blur and fade. The air was slightly warmer than I remembered, or maybe that was just my body temperature rising, my blood moving faster. As I approached the first sealed wall, I examined it more carefully this time. The mortar work was clean. The blocks were placed with precision. This wasn't rushed or emergency work. This was deliberate construction by someone who knew what they were doing. What struck me, though, was the dust. The area immediately around the wall had been recently disturbed. Not swept clean, whoever had built this wall had left no evidence of that kind of care. But the dust had been displaced. There was a slight ridge of it accumulated to one side, as if something had been dragged through here. Something heavy enough to move the fine layer of dust that had accumulated undisturbed for decades. The thought of someone down here moving something through these dark passages made my throat tighten. I continued on to the left tunnel. The descent was the same as I remembered. Gradual, taking me deeper below the town. The darkness beyond my flashlight beam felt present, almost physical. I could hear the electrical hum of my light, the soft whisper of my own breathing, the sound of my footsteps. Everything else was silence. The second wall appeared in my flashlight beam like a monument. I approached it slowly, examining the work again. This wall was older, true, but only slightly. Perhaps weeks older. Perhaps a month. The construction method was identical. Someone with skill and patience had built both of these barriers. Someone methodical. It was as I was running my hand along the mortar, testing its consistency, which I realized now was a pointless gesture, that I noticed something I'd missed before. A small gap, perhaps half an inch, where the blocks hadn't quite met perfectly near the bottom of the wall. The gap was too small to fit anything larger than a thin tool through, but it was there. And in that gap, caught on what might have been a splinter or a small stone, was a single thread of fabric. Dark blue or black, difficult to tell in the flashlight beam. Recent enough that it hadn't faded or disintegrated. Recent enough that whoever had worn the garment it came from might still be walking around the surface of the town with a small tear in their clothes. I pulled gently at the thread. It didn't come free. That's when I heard the sound for the first time. Not the distant rushing water from my previous visit. This was different. A low vibration traveling through the tunnel walls themselves, too distant to locate precisely but close enough to feel in my chest. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then it was gone. My first coherent thought was machinery. Something mechanical, operating deeper in the tunnel system. Pumps, perhaps, or something else. Something that required energy, that needed to operate on a schedule, that had just run for a few seconds and then shut off. My second thought was more complicated. That vibration had come in response to nothing I had done. There was no obvious trigger. I hadn't made noise. I hadn't disturbed anything. So either it had been scheduled to occur at this particular moment, which seemed unlikely but possible, or something down there had detected my presence and activated the machinery in response. I waited for it to happen again. It didn't. I stood in front of the sealed wall for another 10 minutes, listening to the silence reassert itself, feeling the cold of the tunnel seeping into my bones. The thread remained where it was, caught in that small gap. A reminder that someone had been here recently enough that their clothing still bore the marks of their passage. Someone wearing dark clothing. Someone moving through tight spaces. Someone, possibly, who was still moving through these tunnels, deeper down, in sections I hadn't explored yet. When I finally turned to walk back, I took the thread with me. The gap had been tight enough that pulling it free required patient work, small motions, the kind of careful precision that takes longer than you'd expect. When it finally came free, I held it up to the flashlight. The fabric was synthetic, worn, but not degraded. The kind of thing you'd find on work clothes. The kind of thing someone would wear if they were spending time in places where regular clothing might be damaged. The walk back to the surface seemed longer than the walk down. Or perhaps I was moving more slowly, listening more carefully to every sound, every shift in the air pressure, every settled change in the tunnel's character. By the time I reached the basement, my legs were shaking slightly. Not from fear, I told myself. From exertion, from the cold, from the unnatural position of being underground for an extended period. I climbed back through the access point as daylight was beginning to fade. The town above me was ordinary and quiet, houses with lit windows, cars parked in driveways. The normal evening movement of people returning home from work or beginning their nights. None of them knew about the tunnels. None of them understood that beneath the streets they walked on, beneath the foundations of their homes, something was being done. Something that required walls to seal off sections. Something that required the presence of someone willing to operate machinery in the dark. That night, I researched the thread. I have a basic knowledge of fabrics, enough to narrow down possibilities. The synthetic material was likely a polyester blend, common enough to narrow down nothing. The construction suggested work clothes or protective gear. The fading pattern suggested extended exposure to moisture or dampness. It could have come from anyone. It could have been there for months. But I didn't believe that. The way it was positioned in the gap suggested recent displacement. The way the fabric felt, still having some structural integrity rather than being brittle with age, suggested days or weeks, not longer. Someone down there was wearing clothes like this. Someone was moving through those tight passages. Someone was maintaining those walls and operating that machinery and doing whatever it was they needed to do in the sealed sections I hadn't reached. The dreams came again that night. This time I was closer to something, still in darkness, still moving forward without a working light. But there was something ahead of me now, something that had a shape, though I couldn't quite see it. I could hear it more clearly, a rhythmic sound, like breathing, like something large and patient and fully at ease with the darkness. When I woke, I was standing at my bedroom window. I have no memory of getting out of bed or moving across the room. I was simply there, in the dark, looking out at the sleeping town, at the streets that covered the tunnels, at the houses under which they ran like veins through stone. And for just a moment, I thought I felt that same vibration from the tunnels. A distant thrumming in the earth itself, felt through the foundation of my building, transmitted upward through wood and insulation and plaster to reach me in my bedroom, 3 stories above the surface, miles from where the tunnels ran. I stood there a long time, until my body temperature normalized and my hands stopped shaking and the town returned to being just a town again. The next morning I called in sick to work. I had already decided that I was going back down into the tunnels, and this time I was going to find out what lay beyond the sealed walls. I bought new batteries, 2 packages of them, industrial grade, the kind meant to last through sustained use. I also bought a knife, not a large one, nothing that would look particularly threatening if I was caught, just something that could cut through barriers if I needed it to. I told myself this was practical thinking. I didn't fully believe myself. The entrance to the tunnels was different in daylight. Or perhaps I was different. The concrete rim of the access point seemed to require more effort to climb down into. The air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. I descended slower this time, more deliberately, more aware of each handhold, each step downward into the absence of light. The beam of my flashlight was stronger today. Brighter, it illuminated the tunnel walls in sharp detail, and I found myself wishing it wouldn't. The texture of the concrete seemed to shift in certain sections, patches where the surface was smoother, almost polished by regular contact, suggesting that something or someone moved through these passages with consistent frequency, not tourists passing through once. Regular travelers, daily routes. I moved past the first sealed wall without stopping. I knew now that it led nowhere I needed to go, but as I passed it, I noticed something I'd missed before. The mortar between the concrete blocks was fresh. Within the last few weeks, someone had reinforced the seal. The joints were neater than they should have been. The work professional, deliberate. This wall wasn't crumbling from neglect. It was being actively maintained. The second sealed section came into view maybe 20 minutes of walking later. This was the one I'd intended to investigate today. The knife was heavy in my pocket. The batteries in my flashlight felt inadequate, though they were full. I approached the wall slowly. Up close, I could see that this seal was different from the first. The concrete blocks here were newer, the mortar even fresher. But more than that, there was something else. A gap. Not the small space where I'd found the fabric, but an actual opening. A section of blocks had been removed from the upper left corner of the wall, leaving a space perhaps 2 feet across. Not sealed. Not lately, anyway. I looked around the tunnel behind me. The light from my flashlight seemed to be swallowed by the darkness farther back, creating an impression of isolation that was probably accurate. I was alone down here, or I was the only one I could see. I approached the gap. My heart was moving at an unusual speed, and I could feel my breath becoming shallow. I told myself this was natural. Of course I was nervous. I was about to breach something that had been deliberately sealed, that had been deliberately reinforced, that someone clearly didn't want accessed. I pointed my flashlight through the opening. Beyond the wall, the tunnel continued, but it was different. The walls were no longer simple concrete. They were lined with something else, metal perhaps, or treated material, something that reflected my flashlight beam in strange ways, creating dancing points of light that made it difficult to focus. The tunnel narrowed significantly. Where the passage I'd been walking was perhaps 8 feet across, This continued section looked to be only 5 or 6 feet wide, with the ceiling correspondingly lower. And there were cables. Thick power cables ran along the walls in bundles, tied with industrial straps. They disappeared into the darkness ahead of the tunnel, toward something that generated enough demand for electricity to require this kind of infrastructure. I placed my hands on the concrete block at the edge of the gap. It was warm. Not the cool dampness I'd expected, but genuinely warm, as though something was generating heat just beyond this wall. I took a breath. I was not a particularly brave person, I had never been, but I had also reached a point where turning back felt impossible. The not knowing had become worse than whatever lay ahead. The small fabric thread, the fresh mortar, the positioning of the bodies in my dreams, the vibration I'd felt through my bedroom floor, it had all accumulated into something that demanded resolution. I pulled myself through the gap. On the other side, the air changed immediately. It was warmer, but also different in composition, almost processed, like air that had been recycled through some kind of system. The cables made more sense now. They weren't just delivering power. They were delivering something. Ventilation, heating, life support perhaps, though I didn't want to think too carefully about that particular word choice. The tunnel stretched ahead, and I could see that it wasn't empty. There were shapes recessed into the walls at regular intervals. Alcoves or storage compartments, I couldn't tell from this distance. I moved forward slowly, keeping the knife in my other hand, keeping my flashlight trained ahead. The first alcove contained nothing but shadow and dust. The second was the same. By the third, I had started to breathe normally again, had started to believe that perhaps this was simply infrastructure, simply the forgotten underbelly of a town that had older systems than anyone currently alive remembered. Perhaps the fabric thread, the maintenance, the heat, perhaps it was all explainable, all part of some municipal project or utility work that had been documented in records I simply hadn't found. The fourth alcove changed that belief. It contained equipment, medical equipment, or at least what I recognized as being in that general category. A monitoring station of some kind, instruments I couldn't name, a chair that didn't look comfortable or designed for leisure, and papers, documents stacked on a shelf. I lifted one with my flashlight, trying to read the text, but the beam made the text swim and shift. I recognized numbers, dates, a code sequence that repeated throughout the document, nothing that made immediate sense. But the dates did. They were recent. Some of them were from the last 3 weeks. I was still processing this when the vibration started again. It was the same sensation I'd felt from my bedroom floor, but here, down here, it was far more distinct. It came from deep in the earth, a resonance that seemed to move through the metal-lined walls of the tunnel itself, setting up a harmonic frequency that I could feel in my bones, in my teeth, in the base of my skull. It was a sound, a low-frequency sound so profound that it bypassed hearing entirely and registered only as physical presence. I turned my flashlight toward the tunnel's continuation. The beam illuminated perhaps 50 feet before darkness swallowed it. But in that illuminated section, I could now see that the tunnel opened into something larger. I could see the edges of what might be a chamber, and I could see that the walls of that chamber were not concrete or metal or any material I recognized. They were curved, organic somehow, despite being clearly non-biological. They seemed to absorb my flashlight beam rather than reflect it, as though the light was being drawn into them, consumed by them. The vibration continued, steady, patient, like the breathing in my dreams. I took a step toward it, then another. I didn't decide to do this consciously. My legs simply moved, propelled by something deeper than conscious thought, something that wanted to know more than it wanted to remain safe. After 5 steps, the vibration stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was absolute. It was the silence of air that hadn't moved in days, of space that nothing had disturbed. It was the silence of something that had stopped because it knew I was there. That had become aware of me. I stood frozen in the tunnel, my flashlight trained on that curved wall in the distance, on that chamber that seemed to be waiting. My hands were shaking now, not from cold, from the certainty, absolute and undeniable, that something down here had just registered my presence, and that something was now considering what to do about me. Behind me, far behind me, I could hear the sound of the concrete tunnel I'd walked through. But ahead of me, from inside that chamber, I could hear something else. I could hear breathing. I backed away. Not quickly, that seemed wrong, seemed like it might provoke something. Just a slow, deliberate retreat, my eyes fixed on that curved wall, my flashlight never wavering from that point of absolute darkness where the chamber opened. 1 step, another, my breath came in measured intervals, forced into a pattern that I thought might keep me calm, might keep me alive. The breathing from the chamber didn't follow me. It didn't advance. It simply continued, steady, vast, utterly inhuman in the way it seemed to fill the space, to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't the breathing of something lungs. It was something else entirely, some exchange of air and emptiness that had nothing to do with respiration as I understood it. I made it back to the junction where the smaller tunnel branched off. I didn't run then either. I turned and walked back the way I'd come, my legs mechanical, my mind somewhere distant and detached. The tunnel seemed longer than it had before. The wall seemed closer. The darkness at the edges of my flashlight beam seemed active, seemed to press in with weight and intention. When I reached the hole in my basement, I climbed through it without looking back. I pulled the sheet of plywood back into place, and I sat on my basement floor for what might have been an hour or might have been much longer. Time felt negotiable down there. Time felt like something that could be adjusted. Eventually, I went upstairs. I took a shower, a long one, hot enough to hurt. I made coffee. I sat in my kitchen as the sun rose, and I did what I've been doing ever since. I tried to move on. That was 6 months ago. The logical part of my mind, the part that exists in daylight and in rational thought, has developed explanations. The medical equipment I saw was probably from some kind of old public health initiative. The documents were likely archived materials that hadn't been properly stored. The vibration was an underground utility, a subway system in an earlier phase of development, perhaps, or a geothermal installation that the town records hadn't yet caught up with. The breathing was a trick of acoustics. The way sound behaves in enclosed spaces, the way panic can reinterpret simple sounds into something threatening. This is what I tell myself. This is what I believe, in the daytime, in rooms with other people. But I don't go back into the basement. Not after dark. Not alone. My sleep has changed. The dreams I'd been having, the ones that felt so vivid, so present, like something reaching into my mind from somewhere else, those stopped. Completely. I sleep now, and there's nothing. A blank space between lying down and waking up. I can't decide if this is a mercy or if it's worse. The absence of dreams where dreams had been feels like a conversation that was interrupted mid-sentence. Instead, I wake up sometimes at 3 or 4 in the morning with a sensation of pressure in my chest. The feeling that something has just been in the room with me. It's gone by the time I'm fully conscious, but the impression remains. The sense that I'm not alone in my own house, even though my doors are locked, even though every logical check says that I am completely, utterly by myself. The town itself has changed. Or maybe I've changed in how I see it. These streets that I grew up on, that I knew so completely they were like the corridors of my own mind, now feel like a surface. Like there's an entire topology beneath them that I stumbled into, and now that I know it exists, I can't stop feeling its presence. I look at the sidewalk and think about what's below it. I hear the mechanical hum of the utility systems beneath downtown, the ones that serve the buildings and the streets, and I wonder how much of that sound is what tag additional middle section. The utility tunnels beneath the town I grew up in the air had weight. That's what I remember most, even now. Not just dampness, I'd expected that, but weight. The kind of atmosphere that pressed against your chest, that made each breath feel deliberate, as if you were pulling something through your lungs rather than simply inhaling it. I stood at the mouth of the first tunnel access point, a corroded metal grate someone had forced open decades ago, and tried to measure the darkness beyond. My flashlight beam barely penetrated 3 feet before the passage seemed to absorb the light entirely. I descended the maintenance ladder slowly, rung by rung. The metal was cold and slick, and my hands kept slipping. Rust came away in orange powder, staining my palms. By the time my feet touched the tunnel floor, my heart had begun a rhythm I couldn't quite control. The rational part of my mind kept insisting this was just an old utility system. Water pipes, maybe electrical conduits, the infrastructure of a town that had grown and then declined without ever fully abandoning these passages. But there was something about the absolute stillness that made the rational part of my mind seem very small and very distant. The tunnel walls themselves were a study in deterioration. Concrete blocks, mostly, stacked and mortared sometime in what I guessed was the 1950s or 60s, now wept with moisture. The water didn't drip so much as seep, creating dark maps across the surface that looked like continents on an inverted world. Calcium deposits had calcified in white streaks where water had traveled the same paths for years, decades even. These white veins caught my flashlight beam in an almost luminous way, creating the unsettling impression that the walls themselves were slowly crystallizing, turning from material substance into something harder, more permanent, more mineral, more dead. The smell was complex in a way I hadn't anticipated, not the simple reek of mold or standing water, though both were present. Underneath that was something else, something like old concrete dust mixed with metal oxidation, a kind of bitter chemical undertone that made my sinuses ache. And beneath that, fainter still, something organic, not decay exactly. More like the smell of a basement that had been sealed for a very long time, where the earth itself seems to have a scent. turned soil. Minerals, the smell of places where sunlight has never reached. I walked deeper. The tunnel seemed to stretch impossibly far, though I knew from the town maps I'd studied that these passages couldn't be more than a few 100 feet in most directions. But distance in the dark works differently. The way the light from my flashlight created a small sphere of visibility around me, with absolute darkness beyond. It made me feel as though I were moving through an endless channel that contracted ahead of me and expanded behind me. Each step forward felt like I was creating the tunnel as I moved through it, and abandoning it the moment I left it behind. The pipes began about 50 feet in. They ran along both walls in parallel bundles, some thick and wrapped in degraded insulation that had turned to a kind of gray felt, others thinner and bare, showing the mottled green patina of oxidized copper. Some pipes still had legible labels stenciled in faded black paint: hot water, return, drain. Others had no markings at all. I trailed my fingers along one of the walls as I walked, and the texture was almost clay-like, the concrete having absorbed so much moisture over the years that it felt soft in places. Crumbly, my palm came away damp. The sound in the tunnels was like nothing I'd experienced in my normal life. At first, I thought the silence was absolute, but it wasn't. There was a kind of subsonic hum, so low I felt it more in my chest than heard it through my ears. Maybe the sound of distant machinery still functioning somewhere in the town above. Maybe the movement of water through pipes. Maybe my own blood, my own heartbeat, amplified by the closed space and my heightened attention. The harder I listened, the less certain I became about what I was actually hearing. And underneath that, something else. Dripping, not the constant measured dripping of a leaky faucet. Instead, random, irregular drops falling at intervals that seemed to follow no pattern. One drip, then silence for 10 seconds, then 2 drips in quick succession, then another silence. The unpredictability of it was worse than a steady rhythm would have been. My mind kept trying to anticipate where the next sound would come from, and the constant violation of those expectations created a low-level anxiety that accumulated with each step. The walls seemed closer in some sections. I found myself putting my hands out to the sides, fingers splayed, to confirm that I still had adequate clearance. The tunnel didn't actually narrow, I think. It was a trick of the darkness, the shadows deepening as my flashlight batteries began their slow decline. But the sensation of compression was real, pressing at my shoulders, making my breathing shallower. The temperature dropped as I went deeper, not dramatically, but noticeably. I'd worn a light jacket, thinking the underground would be consistently cool. I hadn't accounted for how the cold would feel different here, more penetrating. It seemed to come from the earth itself, radiating upward through the concrete floor, settling into my bones in a way that no amount of movement could dispel. I found myself curling my shoulders inward, pulling myself tighter. At one point, I can't remember exactly how far I'd walked, perhaps a quarter mile. I stopped to examine the walls more closely. There were marks on the concrete. Not graffiti, though there was some of that too, faded names and dates carved with what might have been pocket knives or rocks. But other marks, handprints, I realized. Small handprints, made in what might have been chalk or dried mud, pressed against the concrete at varying heights. Some were at adult height, others were much lower. The casual marks of people who had walked these passages, who had touched the walls as they passed. They were pale against the dark concrete. Ghostly, I couldn't tell how old they were. Days? Years? Decades? They seemed to create a kind of chronology of touch, hands upon walls, the only evidence of passage. I moved my own hand toward one of them, my flashlight illuminating the print. My palm was larger, my fingers more spread. I could have covered the mark with my own hand had I pressed it there, absorbing the unknown touch beneath my own. I didn't. The tunnels branched. The first intersection took me by surprise, though logically I'd known the system would be more complex than a single passage. 3 tunnels opened before me, receding in 3 different directions, and for the first time since entering, I felt genuinely uncertain about which way to go. The maps I'd studied had been too general, too schematic. They showed the existence of branches, but not their specific character, not the way they would actually appear to someone standing in the darkness, trying to choose. I stood in that intersection for a long time. My flashlight beam moved from one passage to the next. They seemed identical, the same gray concrete, the same weeping walls, the same complex tangle of pipes overhead, the same darkness that only my small circle of light pushed back. But each tunnel felt different somehow, different in a way I had no language for. One tunnel seemed to slope very slightly downward. Another appeared to have slightly more water damage on its left wall. The third felt, in some unmeasurable way, colder. I chose the middle tunnel almost randomly, or so I told myself. But later, I wondered if I'd been responding to something I hadn't consciously registered. Some quality of air movement, maybe, or the character of the humidity. The oldest parts of us, the parts that lived before language, might know things about enclosed spaces that our conscious minds couldn't articulate. As I continued, I became aware of my breathing in a new way. The act of respiration in such a small space, the exhalation meeting the walls and returning to me, my own breath seeming to accumulate in the passage. I found myself breathing more slowly, trying to manage the way the used air returned to my lungs, mixing with fresh intake. The air tasted increasingly metallic, increasingly old, like breathing underwater in a space where the water had long since evaporated, leaving only its mineral essence behind. The pipes overhead became more intricate. In some sections, the bundles had multiplied, overlapping, creating a chaotic geometry of metal and insulation. Where they passed through the walls, there were gaps, and through these gaps came small breaths of air that seemed to originate from no identifiable source. Cold air, the air of deeper places, the air of places that connected to other places, passages within passages, a honeycomb of infrastructure that I was only touching the surface of. My footsteps echoed, but strangely. Not the sharp echo of a canyon, but something more subdued, dampened by the moisture in the air and the rough texture of the concrete. The sound of my steps seemed to return to me delayed, as if the tunnel itself was slowly processing the fact of my presence. Each footfall felt like I was pressing a weight into the earth, and the earth was considering what to do about it. I realized at some point that I'd lost track of time entirely. My phone was in my pocket, but I couldn't bring myself to check it. The act of looking at the modern world, the bright screen with its useful information, felt transgressive in this space. This place existed in a different temporality, one where minutes and hours had lost their meaning. The passage of time here was measured differently, in the amount of moisture on the walls, in the accumulation of rust on the pipes, in the growth of mold spores in the darkness. Time as it operated in this tunnel was geological, glacial, independent of the clocks that ran on the surface. I pressed deeper still. The walls in some sections had begun to efflorescence, white mineral deposits blooming across the concrete like flowers made of salt. These deposits seemed to shimmer slightly when my flashlight caught them, creating the impression of movement where there was none, of growth. The tunnels, I realized, were not static. They were changing, slowly, incrementally, as water continued its work of transformation. The concrete was becoming something else. The walls were composing a slow and subtle alchemy, and in the darkness ahead, in that circle of light that moved just ahead of where I walked, I kept sensing something just beyond the edge of visibility. Not a sound, not exactly, more like an absence of sound in a specific shape, like something living in the tunnel with me was deliberately not making noise, was exercising extreme discipline to avoid detection. I would sweep my flashlight back and forth, but these sweeps created their own darkness behind them, and whatever I might have been sensing moved in those zones where my light had already passed. The dripping continued, the hum continued, the seeping of moisture from stone continued, the slow weeping of the earth, the walls crying out in their own way. And I continued forward, step by step, deeper into the passages beneath my hometown, breathing the stale air of places that existed in the spaces between the world I knew and something else entirely. At it claims to be, how much of it is something else, something that was here long before the town was built, something that the town was constructed above without understanding what it was covering. I've thought about calling someone, a city official, someone with authority. But what would I tell them? That I found tunnels in my basement? They're in the records, I'm sure. There's probably a perfectly reasonable explanation for why they exist. The chamber, the equipment, the breathing, these are the parts I can't explain. And these are the parts that make the entire account sound like the rambling of someone unstable, someone looking for patterns where none exist. So I say nothing. I live my life. I go to work. I see people. I eat dinner and watch television and perform all the normal rituals that constitute a human existence. I'm quite good at it, actually. You wouldn't know to look at me that anything has changed. But there's a weight to things now, a heft to ordinary days. Sometimes I'll be in my kitchen making lunch, and I'll become acutely aware of the floor beneath my feet, the distance between me and the tunnels below, the layers of foundation and earth that separate this room from that other place. It's a distance I can measure in feet, in engineering specifications, in rational terms. But it doesn't feel that far. It feels like the thickness of a single breath. At night, when I'm in bed, I sometimes become aware of that vibration again. It doesn't come through the floor anymore. It comes through the walls, through the air itself. A low-frequency sensation that travels up from somewhere deep. It never lasts long. Just a few seconds, a reminder that the breathing hasn't stopped. It's still down there, in that chamber with its curved walls and its absolute darkness. Still present, still waiting. I know what I should do. I should leave. Sell the house, move to another town. Put distance between myself and what I found in those tunnels. But every time I consider it, I feel a strange reluctance. It's not fear exactly, it's something more like obligation, a sense that leaving would be a form of betrayal, though I can't articulate betrayal of what or whom. So instead, I stay. I tend my garden, I maintain the house, I work, and I live, and I participate in the constructed normalcy of a person who has experienced nothing unusual. And in the early mornings, when the town is still and the darkness is complete, I lie awake in my bed and listen to the silence, wondering if it's truly silence at all, wondering if, somewhere deep beneath this town that I've spent my entire life calling home, something is also listening, wondering if we're already having a conversation that no waking part of me will ever remember, a dialogue that happens in the spaces between sleep and consciousness, in the ground beneath my feet, in the darkness where I can't follow, but where something has already been waiting, patient and undeniable, since long before I was born.